Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on the recent content with the NBA playoffs underway. We have a handful of, tone setters to cover and a few blowouts to cover. So, it's a very mixed bag, I think you could say, to say the least. But, we had a couple of live streams covering the series openers over the past couple of days. We wanted to shout out a subscriber, the Homelander. He's been carrying our streams with his interactions every night. He's really been bringing the energy and helping us, stay awake at night. But we will have some more later down the line, as the first round progresses and we get closer to eliminations. And before we get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we'll get into day 1 and 2 of the NBA playoffs. Like
Yes,
you
sir.
mentioned, playoffs is always an exciting time.
Yep.
Even though some of the games weren't that great. But either way, we'll get through them. So obviously, day 1 kicked off with Cavs Magic. Cavs win 97-83 to go up 1-0. And this one to me, I picked the Cavs to win the series because I felt like they were the better team, even when both teams are playing at their best, right? Donovan Mitchell had 30 points, 3 steals, 3 assists, pretty much I think was the best player on the floor. And I do think he's the best player on the floor. Jared Allen and Evan Mobley were both great. Both had double-digit points and rebounds, right? Allen at 16 and 18, Mobley at 16 and 11, even had 2 threes, right? 2 of 4 from 3. Not going to shoot 50% from 3, I don't think, every game, but the jump shot is kind of a key thing, and that allows the two big lineup offensively to work when they can, kind of space the floor, with Mobley shooting from the outside and being able to attack mismatches, with also Jared Allen being able to, take advantage of offensive rebounds, right, and finishing around the rim. Because even though the Magic do have a big front line, obviously, they did switch it up and they had Jonathan Isaac at center. Different type of big compared to Wendell Carter Jr. Obviously, much more switchable, much more versatile defensively, but doesn't quite have as much in the back pocket, right? He's a lighter guy. So that makes that makes a little bit of a difference with a guy like Jared Allen in the middle, who's not like a super big guy, but he is, he's a decent size for a center. Um, Not much off the bench, right? Karis LeVert, Georges Niang, Isaac Okoro, they were relatively fine, but they were not super efficient. But nobody really was really efficient, right? For Orlando, right? And that was kind of the difference was the Cavs' offensive game was just a lot better. They had better offensive players. Um, the backcourt was good, right? Particularly Mitchell. I know Garland, he got some of his shots kind of later in the game when it was over, but still fine. And then, like I said, the bigs were good. Strus was not great. The bench was not great. But then you look over at Orlando and you kind of see where it's going to be a problem for them to be able to win 4 out of 7 is that offense. They had 83 points, which was the lowest by a decent margin in the playoffs. Um, and they lost by double digits. So that's rough. 8 of 37 from 3. So that's 21%. 32.5% from the field, which is abysmal. Um, and on top of that, right? I think they had 7 turnovers, or no, they had 12 turnovers. So just not great.
Yeah,
Um,
overall, it was wild, man. Like, the Magic, it was disgusting, if you want me to be blunt, And I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, it was really bad.
yeah, I mean, Paolo Banchero, first playoff game, 24 points, 5 assists, 7 rebounds. So that's cool. 9 of 17 from the field, over 50%. Good. 2 of 7 from 3, not great, but he still shot over 50%. But the real problem was the 9 turnovers. That was problematic. And that really comes from, again, when you're the Magic, you don't really have a guy that's a traditional point guard, or any real type of, facilitator other than really Paolo, because most of the other guys are probably better off like as connectors or like finishing pieces. Not really guys that like can really run your offense. Like Jalen Suggs, I feel like is probably more of like a 2, like a 3-and-D type guy than a point guard. And then Gary Harris is basically really only out there on offense to hit threes. Literally didn't hit any threes, so that's not
Yeah.
necessarily great. A 3-point shooter that isn't shooting well. I know he's a good defender, so obviously he can do things other than just shoot, but you just didn't have enough offensively, right? Wendell Carter Jr. came off the bench, didn't really do anything. Fultz had a goose egg. Harris had a goose egg. and Franz Wagner still can't shoot, right? He was 2 of 6 from 3. One of those threes was really when the game was over. I mean, and that's a problem, right? Because we know that Wagner has not shot the ball from 3 well this year, whatever reason. Don't really know why. It just hasn't worked. Paolo has become the better 3-point shooter of the two this year. Didn't really shoot great from 3 this night, but he did other stuff, right? He's a better athlete. Um, and everything else. So that's kind of the thing if you're Orlando is you need the other guys to really show up. And Wagner was okay, right? Like, I mean, they lost by, 14. I mean, they were down by like 20 at one point. So like the final score made the game look a little bit better than it actually was, but it was ugly. And you just can't have that poor of an offensive production from so many players. I mean, even in the second unit, right? Mo Wagner was the only guy that had more than like 3, 4 points off the bench. And that's just a problem, especially when some of the other starters played really poorly, including a guy who was scoreless and another guy who was 4 for 16.
Yeah, and looking looking at Orlando, like you said, it's really bad. When Gary Harris isn't hitting, you kind of hope to go to Cole Anthony, but then he wasn't hitting. The rotation, it just really wasn't working out. The bench looked atrocious. But I think you feel better about Cleveland about this matchup. And the funny thing is, I switched my pick to Orlando just because I thought their defensive prowess would be something that would potentially bother Cleveland, and I think it did to an extent. Especially in the second unit, but the starters, they kind of just overwhelmed them. And then Cleveland's defense turned into offense. That was the key. And then obviously, and that's going, beyond what Donovan Mitchell is doing, or he's going to do on a nightly basis where, he put up 30 points and led them to the win. And then you have other guys on Cleveland who are doing their job, and Darius Garland, Jared Allen, Evan Mobley. And I think, this was the ideal game you would want to have if you're Cleveland because Evan Mobley's hitting his threes, giving Jared Allen the space to work. Darius Garland, he turned the ball over a decent chunk of times, but I think he was aggressive, and I think that's the best version of him. Then you have Donovan Mitchell being consistent.
I mean, you can get away with an okay Garland game when everyone else
Yep.
other than Strus played well, right? Like Mobley and Allen played really well. So you don't have to have like 25 points from Garland when the bigs play as well as they played. And like you said, the defense turned into offense because Orlando did play really good defense. I mean, I know the Cavs shot 44% from the field, but some of that, like you said, was the fact that when the Cavs played defense, they were able to get out and score. But
Yeah.
when the Magic played defense and tried to get out and score, they could not. So
Yeah.
that is another difference there. And that's again the lack of, really any offensive creation from the perimeter. You just and that's probably something that Orlando's going to have to target in the offseason where you're probably going to need to find some type of guard that can create, offensively for themselves and others, right? There's going to be I think some type of players in free agency that will fit that bill. I don't know if they're going to get them, but we already talked about they have a lot of guards and they all kind of do different things, but none of them really fill the role of a real point guard. And that's kind of the issue there. And that's probably where, if that doesn't get sorted out in this series, then they're going to be going home and then they're going to have some questions in the offseason. But either way, with the Magic, this is their first time in the playoffs, too. So it's not really the end of the world if they don't win this series.
Right.
Whereas for the Cavs, we already know there's a lot of pressure in this postseason where if they go out in the first round again, which is still possible because it's game one, there's going to be a lot of questions about what they're going to do with that group, right? Because Donovan Mitchell, do they keep him long term? Does he ask out? Do they even want to keep him if they end up just flaming out? We don't know. So, and that's the kind of the thing with game one is where you don't always want to overreact to what you see. There's a lot of different results. Sometimes we've seen teams win game one, then lose 4 in a row. We've seen teams win game one and then win all, the next 3 games and sweep. We've seen teams blow teams out in game one and then get blown out right in game two. Or we've seen a blowout in the first couple of games and then, the last couple of games are close. So it's just, and that's kind of, it's a game to game thing, right? Where, adjustments have to be made on both ends, right? Because we know Orlando's going to try to make some adjustments to probably get some of their guys going offensively. We know Cleveland's probably going to make certain adjustments as well. So it's a chess match, right? And we know that these are two good teams, but I do think the Cavs are better because, again, like they tanked that last game to get this matchup. So realistically, they're probably a little bit closer to like, some of the other teams ahead of them. But, obviously they're not near Boston, right? But they might be closer to like, maybe a team like, New York without, some of the other guys, even though I think New York is better. But you know what I mean? Like, I think they're
Sure.
in a little bit higher tier. than the Magic. But again, this could be a long series. We know the Magic are really good at home, so it's possible if they win all their home games, right, it could go 7, and then they would just have to win one in Cleveland. But we just don't know, and that's
Yeah.
kind of the unpredictability of some of these series.
Yeah, and I think Orlando's like path to success would have to be, winning the game, game 2, which is I think a tall task for them to accomplish, just due to the fact that their offensive consistency is so bad, and it doesn't help that the guard play I think is going to be the deciding factor in this series, unfortunately. And when you have Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell pretty much outplaying your entire guard room combined for an entire series, I think that's a very tall task. And they might not be cut out for it, but I'm going to still, stick by my prediction because I think their toughness and defense and, the defensive tenacity is going to bother, I think, one of the bigs at some point, and I think it's going to get ugly later down the line in the series. I think this is going to be a 7-game series.
And that's the other factor. Say like Mobley, if he keeps up his 3-point shooting or just hits jump shots in general, then that's a different ball game. But if he kind of reverts back to not being really much of a floor spacer, then that makes Cleveland's offense a little bit tougher. It
Right.
makes it a little bit harder to play the two bigs. If their two bigs can play together, then they're probably just going to be able to win. But if the shots aren't falling from Mobley, then that's where they're probably going to have to separate them. There are times where they can separate them and they're both fine because it's not like the Magic have like a devastating 7-footer, right? Like say like when they played the Knicks last year, they have 2 7-footers, right? And those guys really, really, really took it to the Cavs bigs individually. But this time around, it's not the same thing, right? It's a
Right.
different team. Matchups make fights. And like you said, I think Orlando can make it to this series. It's just the offense is going to have to be better.
Yep.
Um, and like you said, it starts with the backcourt. If you can get like 2 good performances from guards, then you can kind of maybe turn it around. And I think you're gonna need at least like one of the starters and one of the backups to be good. Like because I think you can get away with like they can kind of cancel each other out. Like if one off the bench is good and then the other starting guy is bad, but if like everybody's bad, then yeah, you got no chance.
Mm-hmm. And I think, another thing that's kind of showing its ugly head is unfortunately, playoff experience. They're just lacking that experience. And, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we see some other young teams.
Yeah. And then moving on, Suns, Timberwolves. This was game 1. I think this was one that we were kind of surprised by. We both had the Suns winning this series. But the Timberwolves really took it to Phoenix, 120-95, and on both ends of the floor, right? I mean, and that's kind of the factor for Minnesota, where you kind of wonder what it looks like come playoff time, right? Because people, you know, know and understand the logic and the reasoning behind the two bigs, but a lot of people kind of question whether or not will it work in the postseason. And obviously in this game it worked pretty well, right? I know Towns had the -2 plus minus, right? I think he did a good job of not really settling for jump shots as opposed to just kind of firing away from three, right? Like the Timberwolves using their size to their advantage. Even Gobert, right, at 14 points, 16 rebounds, got to the line a ton, which also helps, right? Because if you can get guys for the Suns in foul trouble, that can make a difference. Um, but and then obviously McDaniels defensively guarding Devin Booker, pretty much taking him out of the game. But the two big differences here was one, Anthony Edwards was the best player on the floor, particularly in the second half. Right, he had 18 of his 33 points in the third quarter, 9 rebounds, 6 assists, 2 steals, 4 of 8 from three. He really struggled in the regular season series, and that's probably the biggest reason as to why Minnesota lost all 3 games by a big margin. Is that their best player was really bad, and it's really tough to win games against the team if your best player is awful, right? Because it's one thing like if your best player is like okay or like just not great and they're supplemented by other guys. But if they're just awful, like you need some really outlier performances from some other guys in order to pull it off. And again, that's kind of the question as to whether or not this performance was an outlier. He did make some tough shots, but then you also factor in who on the Suns in that starting group is really going to be capable of kind of guarding him and limiting him, because all of them kind of have some weaknesses defensively, right? Like Beal's kind of probably the best defender recently of the guys, right? Obviously he's the one that's had to take, I think, had the most sacrifice, right, in terms of the touches, right? Like it's just a little bit different. So obviously that means you should have some more energy for defense. Um, But then it's like, you look around, 6 of 10 for Beal, 15 points, 6 rebounds. That's fine, right? But you would probably like a little bit more.
Hmm.
Durant at 31 and 7, which is good, but he did have 5 turnovers. And that's going to be a key for the Suns that, again, these guys sometimes do turn the ball over a lot, right? Because even though they can pass and play make, that's not the main thing that they do off on offense. And that's going to be the key in terms of the Suns being able to make a deep run is can they avoid some of the real problems in terms of some of the clunkiness in terms of like how these three guys sometimes don't necessarily always look great together. When they're rolling and hitting shots, it's good. But when the shots aren't falling and they have to find some ways to create some good offense, that's where it looks kind of tough. Booker was awful, 5 of 16. I mean, and that it was kind of interesting to see how the Timberwolves defended them because that's kind of the question that we had was we know the Wolves are the number one defense in the NBA, but they haven't matched up well against the Suns. So could they guard them effectively? And they pretty much were okay with Durant pretty much just going to town on Gobert and Towns, no pun intended. And they were okay with just letting him get his and not really getting anybody else involved. And they were okay with just basically singling out Devin Booker and taking him out of the game. They were like, we're okay with Beal getting his, shots at the rim, right? And his little 12, 15-foot jumpers. We're okay with Durant with the pull up jump shots and the threes, but we can't let all three of them go off. If we take Devin Booker out, who's the point guard, that can kind of hurt, the Suns' offense because he's probably the best passer playmaker of the three. Um, and he's got the ball in his hands the most, right? So that's kind of the thing is that if they can limit Booker and then kind of just not let Beal and Durant cook, then that's a pathway. But then also the bench, right? Nikhil Alexander Walker at 18 off the bench, 4 of 9 from three. And that's the other thing is that the Wolves are, have a little bit more depth than the Suns, right? They just have more playable guys off the bench. You looked at Phoenix's bench, they gave you nothing. Royce O'Neal was fine, 5 of 10 from the field, 14 points, 4 rebounds, solid defense. But nobody else did anything. Eric Gordon was bad. Drew Eubanks was bad. And the other guys that came off the bench came off the bench in garbage time, so they don't really count, right? Like Okogie didn't really play. Thaddeus Young didn't really play. Nasir Little didn't play. Bol didn't play. Those guys have been out of the rotation. So they really only played like 7 guys, right? Eubanks played 9 minutes. Grayson Allen got hurt too. And that's kind of another factor is that, when he's out there spacing the floor and shooting the three, if he's knocking them down, that's really helpful. If not, it's a problem because then those guys are going to get attacked on the defensive end. Um, and that's the key for Minnesota is on offense. You know, what do they do? Because they've not been a great offensive team for most of the year. And if that flips, then they're going to win the series. If the offense kind of goes back to what it was, because this was a really good offensive performance, but some of that was also because the defense led to the offense. They played good defense and they were able to get out and run. But then even in the half court, especially in the second half, Edwards was cooking, talking trash. Naj Reid was out there doing globetrotter stuff. And that's kind of the difference is that they do have more good players, even though the top end talent isn't necessarily as high. We'll see how Phoenix and Frank Vogel and the Suns respond. They need to win this next game, or else it's going to be really difficult for them to win the series because once you lose the first 2 games, you have to win basically what 4 out of the next 5 games, which is
Yeah.
a really tall task. I mean, that's the tough part because that basically means you can't lose more than 1 game over the course of 5 games. We know that historically, when you go down 2-0, you're probably not going to win the series. So they have to bounce back in this next game, or else the series is going to be done faster than we think.
Yeah, and it's like right now I feel like the split is like 50-50. You don't know who's really going to win the series. I think by game 3 or 4 we'll probably have a better feeling, or maybe even who knows. Like you said, if the Wolves go up 2-0, then I think we'll probably know who's in the driver's seat for sure. But I'm looking at this game and even really the series as a whole. I'm looking at Anthony Edwards and Kevin Durant. I think that's kind of the duel at this point. If Booker's not going to be the guy this series, and if Anthony Edwards can outduel Kevin Durant, Minnesota wins the series automatically. That's kind of how I feel. I think we talked about that in the live stream on Saturday. So that's kind of like the way that I'm looking at this series. I'm looking for more from Beal, especially when Devin Booker's limited. I expect Beal to kind of step up and take over because I know that everybody knows he can score. We saw what he was able to do in Washington, although not as competitive as an environment, but nonetheless, that doesn't take away from his ability. We've seen him kind of ball in the playoffs before. So we know what he's capable of. It's just a matter of, you got to do it. And to be fair, Minnesota's no slouch on defense. Obviously, they're one of the top in the NBA. But I think you do have to show up to a point. And then Devin Booker, I really don't want to like harp on him too long because I think Jaden McDaniels is one of the more elite defenders in the NBA. When he's guarding you for the entire game, pretty much 38 minutes apiece. They both played 38 minutes. You can tell he was sticking him the entire time, made him uncomfortable. He hit the deck a lot, and that's a lot to ask. But two of the three of the guys on the Suns have to go off. It's either got to be Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, Bradley Beal, Devin Booker. Whatever combo you want. It's got to be at least two out of the three if they want to win this series, and that's a tall task because if you look around Minnesota, like you said, they're deep. Got Naz Reid coming off the bench, who's amazing, 6th Man of the Year finalist. You've got Alexander Walker, who's been lighting it up recently. Even a guy like Monte Morris, he can kind of calm the bench as well. So it's tough. But right now I'm leaning towards more 50-50, and I'm not really scared of the pick because it's first to 4, not first to 1. So, but this was a huge statement opener, like huge tone setter.
I did not see this one coming.
Me neither.
I did not expect, especially like, from the tip, it kind of felt like Minnesota had the edge. And like it wasn't like they were blowing them out in the first half, but they were up by double digits for a little bit, then pushed it out to 15. Then the Suns kind of got it, back to within 10 or whatever. And then in the second half, it was just a disaster.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the worst case scenario, I think, for the Suns is you can't really afford to get blown out in a playoff game because we saw like a lot of these teams had these statement games, and like the teams kind of tried to fight back. But in the playoffs, it is very difficult to like, overcome a big deficit like that because there's a lot more pressure, there's a lot more fatigue, and it's just hard. And that's kind of the thing is that with Minnesota, in the playoffs, it's going to be really interesting to see what they do because I think, you were very high on them last year. And I think there were a lot of people going into the season that thought that it was going to work, and it kind of just disappointed. They did have injuries going into the playoffs like McDaniels and Reed. Maybe that changes the first round. Who knows? But this year it's been a lot better, and a lot of it's been because Gobert's been a lot better, with the combination of Edwards also taking another step forward. And like you said, it's really going to come down to the stars because if it's two of the three Suns that are going to be playing, and then like one of them is going to be taken out, then it's like how well does Edwards play against the leading scorer? Because I think we probably expect, based off of how the defense is going, that it's probably going to be Durant that's going to be able to score the most consistently because he's being guarded by Gobert and Towns, right? We just don't really have the ability to stay in front of him like that. They're going to try. But
he's a walking mismatch.
Yeah, exactly. He's the same height as them, but a lot more mobile.
Yep.
So that's kind of the difference there. But if you kind of limit Booker, right, then I think that makes it a lot tougher for them to get into their offense because, like I said, I think he's the point guard. So it's kind of like basically taking out the point guard on the team and kind of basically just leaving it up to the scorers to decide. And we'll see because, like you said, it's the first to 4, and we've seen some of this type of stuff happen. Do those shots go in, in the next game? We'll see. But we do know that Minnesota's defense is probably going to be consistent. But it is just kind of wild because, again, the lesson we're learning in a lot of these games is how different the postseason is from the regular season, which we already know.
Yeah.
But
it's a good reminder.
But it's just a reminder, right? Because again, like Minnesota lost all 3 games in the regular season to the Suns pretty convincingly. Actually, literally a week ago, right? In the regular season finale, they got crushed, right? So I mean, to see in game 1 of the playoffs, the script completely flipped, and all of a sudden the Suns looked like the team that was overmatched was really kind of surprising to me. But again, if Edwards plays like a superstar, that's how Minnesota is going to be able to make a deep run, particularly, if the two bigs can kind of figure out how to coexist. And so far, in game 1, they did a solid job. They did have some lineups where it was just one of the two, which they always do. And obviously Naz Reid is a factor as well because he's usually the second big that they put out there where it's like he splits time with Gobert or splits time with Towns. So that's really going to be the key is Minnesota does have more playable guys. It's just a matter of do they all show up?
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel.
Next up, Sixers-Knicks. This was another game where, we or another series where we kind of expected it to be a dogfight. This game was a dogfight. We both leaned towards the Knicks winning the series because we didn't necessarily trust that Embiid was healthy enough to be able to win out this series just based off of how good he is. In the playing game, he didn't really look that great. In the first half of this game, he pretty much looked like himself, right? He had like 18 points at halftime, very efficient, looked dominant. None of New York's bigs had any answers for him whatsoever. And then towards the end of the first half or in the second quarter, he did a self lob, came down hard. It was really scary. You were really concerned that he had, really messed up his knee again. And he was out for a good chunk of the second quarter, as the Knicks built up a big lead. And then, fortunately, he came back in the second half, but just didn't really look the same, right? He was 8 for 22, 2 of 8 from three, 29 points, 6 assists, 8 rebounds. He wasn't terrible, right? But it just didn't feel quite the same as it was in the first half. So, what kept them in the game was the other guys. Maxey was good with 33 points. Lowry with a vintage performance, 18 points, 2 assists, 4 rebounds. Oubre was solid, 10 points, 5 steals. He was the guy. He was a guy at different points that guarded Brunson. They threw a lot of different guys at him. Sometimes it was Maxey, sometimes it was Lowry, sometimes it was Oubre. Um, Harris was not great, 7 points, 9 rebounds. Some of that was, in the fourth, but just not a great performance from him. Batum came back down to earth, so Miami Heat fans are probably really mad about that. He had 3 points and was 1 for 4. Buddy Hield didn't really do anything. Paul Reed, and really that's the difference is the bench for the Sixers, where they were great against the Heat, just didn't really do anything against the Knicks. And you look over at the Knicks, their bench was great, right? Because this was a game where Jalen Brunson struggled, 22 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists, but 8 of 26 from the field. But when you get Bojan Bogdanovic, that had 13 and 7, he did shoot 4 for 12, but he did shoot 3 of 6 from 3 and made some timely baskets, especially in the second quarter and the fourth quarter. Mitchell Robinson was great, got every rebound, 8 points, 12 rebounds, 4 blocks, 7 offensive rebounds, which was nuts. And then Miles McBride off the bench, 21 points, 4 assists, 3 rebounds, 5 to 7 from 3. I got to give a lot of credit to him because when they traded quickly, I wasn't really sure if he was going to be able to transition into the role of the backup point guard. But he's been great. He's basically done everything that the Knicks have asked from him on both ends of the floor. Um, and again, that was one of the big differences because Brunson struggled. So you needed other guys to be able to get some things done on the offensive end. Josh Hart was great, especially in the fourth quarter. 4 of 8 from 3. A lot of those were in the fourth quarter when the Knicks offense kind of started sputtering. 22 points, 13 rebounds. Anunoby chipped in 5 of 10 from the field, 11 points, 4 rebounds. But really, that's kind of the key here was that for the Knicks, it really was a team effort in a game where Brunson, this was probably his worst offensive performance in a while, right? Because most games as of late, he had been averaging like almost 40 a game on really good efficiency. But the Sixers really did a good job defensively of limiting him. It was just the Knicks got so many second chances with the offensive rebounds. They had 23 offensive boards, and the bench showed up. And that's just tough, right? The Sixers are not a great rebounding team. Even with Embiid out there, because he's really the guy that you really expect to get most of the rebounds. And obviously there were stretches where he wasn't out there because he was hurt in the second quarter. And then even when he came back, he just wasn't the same. And if he's gonna look kind of like how he did in the second half, the rest of the series, I just don't really trust Philadelphia to be able to pull it out. So I still feel like the Knicks will win the series, but I will admit the first half initially kind of made me rethink my pick, where I'm like, why did I pick the Knicks to win? But we just don't know, and that's kind of the frustrating and unfortunate thing with Embiid, where it seems like there's always, unfortunately, something going on with him physically, and it becomes really hard to trust that Philadelphia can make a deep run if your best player, just he's kind of limited.
Yeah, for sure, especially, health wise. And like, the Knicks, I think, their unsung hero or very sung hero actually was Josh Hart. He did his thing with the 22 points, the clutch threes, pretty much had that never back down, never give up attitude. And that's kind of what the Knicks embody, I did like the approach, from Philly, like you were talking about with limiting Brunson. The problem is when you double people and you're playing that zone, you're giving up a lot of open shots to some quality shooters. Sometimes they might not hit, but, eventually if they're taking 8, 10, they're going to hit, and that's kind of what happened. Josh Hart, he wasn't shooting the ball that great up until, that fourth quarter, and they were continuously doubling Brunson, which meant he was wide open. Even like a guy like DiVincenzo didn't play as much as Josh Hart, obviously. Josh Hart played 42 minutes, DiVincenzo played 24, but regardless, same predicament where, a lot of these guys left wide open. But then you have a guy like Miles McBride who's kind of replacing Brunson's on the ball creation, especially from the three. I was very surprised by that. And it's like, if you look at his stats, he's been shooting very well from three this entire season, very differently from, previous seasons. But like, I don't think the Sixers or the Knicks really expected that. 5 for 7 from three is kind of crazy. And plus 37 in the plus minus category is definitely wild. So I think that was kind of like the unforeseen aspect of this game for sure. And then obviously, like you said, with Embiid, that first half had me very, very scared. Really, the first quarter, that was the one where I was like, okay, yeah, he looks like prime Embiid. And I guess it's kind of crazy because in the Heat game, he looked very ginger. He didn't really seem like he was all there physically, but he came out strong, and I think that was a huge statement. And I think even in this loss, it kind of tells you like what this series would potentially look like if Embiid was fully healthy. And I think that's where you kind of start to see, the contrast. But at the same time, you could probably say the same thing about the Knicks because they don't have Julius Randle. But regardless, I think this is going to be a competitive series. I don't know how far it's going to go, but I think every game is going to be very close. I don't think we're going to be looking at any blowouts in this series.
The thing is that like if Embiid is healthy, I think the Sixers win that series because he's gonna be because then that means he'd be the best player on the floor
Yep.
by a pretty significant margin. And the Knicks and the Sixers, or excuse me, the Knicks wouldn't really have much of an answer for him because he'd be getting guys in foul trouble, and then so you couldn't really do much.
Yeah.
But if he hobbled, that's where you kind of have to lean New York because a hobbled version of Embiid just when Embiid is healthy, it kind of covers up a lot of some of the other problems with the Sixers team. Not saying it's a bad team at all. It's just your superstar guy makes up for a lot, right? Because you can get away with not having a ton of size and rebounding when your best player is a really good rebounder. You can get away with not having a lot of other guys that can really protect the rim when your best player is a pretty good rim protector.
Right.
But when he's kind of a shell of himself, then that's where some of the other flaws of the team become more apparent. They do have a lot of depth, so a lot of guys can kind of show up in each game. Like again, we saw Kyle Lowry have a really good game, and then the previous game it was Nick Batum. But then you also see like because those guys are kind of role players, they're not always going to show up. You just kind of have to hope if you're Philly that a different guy shows up each game and that it's enough to get you over the top. But you need your best player to play at his best, I think, if you want to win the series because the
Yeah.
Knicks are a good team even without Randall. It's going to be hard for the Knicks, I think, to make a deep run without Randall because I just think in terms of his production, it would be nice to have that, even though we do know in the postseason he's generally been a lesser version of himself. But it's better to have that option than to not have it at all.
Yeah, it'll help alleviate a lot of pressure off of Brunson, which I think was an issue and clearly is going to be an issue if Philly takes the same approach in which, they're going to be doubling him and making him uncomfortable the entire series. It'd be nice to have your second option.
And then moving on, Lakers Nuggets, right? Obviously a rematch of last year's Western Conference Finals, except this time it's in the first round. We both, picked the Nuggets to win this series. And pretty much this game kind of showed why, right? Like that the Nuggets, even though they're not the 1 seed this year, we both think that they're the best team in the Western Conference. And I think this was kind of a statement win where it was kind of interesting though, right? Because in the first half, it didn't really look like that, right? Like in the first half, LeBron and AD pretty much got wherever they wanted to on the floor. Aaron Gordon got into foul trouble, and that was kind of huge because when he's not out there, it's kind of a cakewalk to the rim for LeBron and AD because you don't really have anybody else that's athletic and big and physical to kind of contend with those two. Even though Jokic is a big guy, obviously he needs Aaron Gordon with him, right? Ideally, to kind of make that defensive grouping work because that adds additional size and athleticism that you don't have. But then obviously the issue for the Lakers was, as quickly as they built up a 12-point lead, then it got even quicker erased, right? In just the span of a couple of minutes, it got whittled down, right? And that's kind of the rough part where it's like that's where if you're the Lakers, that's kind of where it's really tough because you got a great first half from LeBron and AD where they were the two best players on the floor by a pretty decent margin. And all that really got you was basically a tie game, right? LeBron hit this, pull up logo three or whatever at the end of the first half to put them up by three. Yeah. But it was basically a tie game right before that, which is not great, right? If those two guys are outplaying Jokic and Murray, you shouldn't be tied. right? Like you should be up by a decent amount because that's kind of what it came down to in last year's series was those two guys late in the fourth just weren't quite good enough, right? Where Jokic and Murray were the two best players on the floor. But what's frustrating is that for most of this game, they were the two best players on the floor. And then the second half it just kind of went completely awry. The offense fell apart completely, and then the Nuggets took advantage, got out and ran, and pretty much ran him off the floor in the second half, which is kind of what we had seen in the regular season matchups for the most part. Um, but for the Lakers, that's the frustrating part because outside of LeBron and AD, you didn't really get much else, right? Which was kind of a what we saw in last year's playoffs for the most part, right? Like Rui, he had a tough job because he was guarding Jokic for a while, battling on the boards. But he wasn't really involved at all on offense. They didn't really look for him. Reeves was pretty quiet for most of the game. He finished with 13, but I think half of those were pretty much when the game was basically over. And then D'Lo, right? He had 13 points, 2 steals, 3 assists, but he was 6 of 20, which is kind of wild, right? Because in last year's conference finals matchup, he was pretty much invisible offensively, where he wasn't even really looking to do anything.
Yeah.
And they took him out of the series, but this time it felt like he was just trying to do way too much. Um, I mean, like not all of the shots were bad. Some of the shots were open, good looks that he's been making all year that he just missed. But then there were some other shots, right? Like, a couple of forced pull-ups over guys like Aaron Gordon, a couple of floaters in the lane, that were just not great looks. And then some of the, he only had one turnover, right? But there were like a couple that were like some momentum plays, right? Where it was like LeBron was ticked off, right? Because there was a play where they were on the break and LeBron had a good look, and he just threw it away, right? And you could see the look on LeBron's face where he was not very pleased, right? And then Denver scored. There was another play where I think it was a 3-point game, and D'Lo had like a layup on the break, smoked it, and then it turned into a transition play for the Nuggets. And then instead of going up 5, right, you missed the layup, and it's basically a turnover tie game.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the tough part against this team is it's like LeBron said, you had to play mistake-free basketball. If you make mistakes against that team, they're going to burn you. And he made some mistakes as well, right? He had 7 turnovers. Right? It was relatively quiet in the second half, but you got enough from AD where if you had gotten enough from like 2 other guys, you probably could have had a chance to win the
I would
game.
even say just one, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Like,
And we
but
all know who it is.
right. But that's the but that's the issue, really, is that we know
Yeah.
D'Angelo Russell just doesn't necessarily match up great with this team. And again, like it wasn't like every shot he took was bad. It's kind of the same issues that you've seen when he plays against these type of teams, where he looks overwhelmed, he looks like he's in his head, and he just loses his confidence. Right? He had a shot that he just airballed, right, and
Yeah.
he's been shooting the ball really well. He's basically been their best shooter pretty much all year. Um, and when shots like that aren't going your way, it's rough, right? And that's kind of the problem where they need him to be at least decent, right? Like you don't expect him to kind of like be the regular season guy, but he can't be 6 of 20. And he obviously can't be like, 0 for 2 either. But the problem is you don't really have another guard off the bench that you can really comfortably turn to and be like, we can replace D'Lo's offense with this guy. We know that Dinwiddie and Gabe Vincent are much better defenders, but they haven't been the same guys on offense. And you need D'Angelo Russell to be, ideally you would like all of them to show up, right? You would like D'Lo to be good, and then in the second unit you want, either Dinwiddie or Vincent to be good, right? Vincent was in foul trouble early, picked up 3 fouls. A couple of them were like kind of like not really good calls. I think where he's like just chasing around screens, which was kind of interesting because there were a lot of fouls called early in the game on both sides, right? Where
Yeah.
like Aaron Gordon had 2 quick fouls, Peyton Watson had 2 quick fouls, Gabe Vincent had like 3 quick fouls, D'Lo had 2 quick fouls. So it all kind of balanced out. But for the Lakers, it's kind of the reasons why we know it's just not a great matchup for the Nuggets, right? You look over on the other side, and this was kind of the game ideally that you would have needed to win because it was a game where Jamal Murray wasn't Superman, right? Like he was in last year's playoffs against the Lakers, where he averaged over 30 a game, right? He did have 22 points, he did have 6 rebounds, and he did have 10 assists. So he had a decent all around game, but he was 9 of 24 from the field. Right. So like you would take that if you're the Lakers any day of the week where Jamal Murray shoots 38% from the field. But then it's like, Jokic did his thing, which you expect, but AD pretty much matched him for the most part. So you can live with that, right? But Aaron Gordon, after the 2 fouls, right, didn't foul again. He had 12, 11, and 7, so almost a triple double. Michael Porter Jr. was solid, 19 and 8. with 2 blocks and a steal. Caldwell Pope, 4 of 10 from 3, which is good. 4 of 11, not great, but and then even Peyton Watson came right in and hit 2 threes, right? Basically wide open. And that's what we talked about in the live stream, where it's like you blitz Jamal Murray and try to slow him down. It opens up shots for other guys. And if those guys knock down those shots, that's a problem. But, that's something that you kind of have to try to decide whether you want to concede. Do you want to just let Jamal Murray go one on one and just take guys off the dribble and pretty much cook? Or would you rather try to slow him down and just try to kind of like gamble that other guys don't really replace his offensive production? But that's the tough part. Even DeAndre Jordan came in and gave them like some productive minutes,
Yeah.
right? Like, which just can't really happen, if you're LA. And then on the other end, D'Lo is like 6 of 20, or Austin Reeves doesn't really do much. And that's the tough problem, right? So now game 2 pretty much becomes a must win. But again, like Denver can also play better than they played in this game. What if Jamal Murray doesn't shoot 9 for 24 and he has like, a 35-point game, right? Or like what if Michael Porter Jr., has a even more efficient game than he had in this game? Or even like Aaron Gordon, right? He had like 30, I think, in game 4 of the Western Conference Finals last year. So that's kind of the scary part, where it's like the Nuggets can play better. Like, I guess some of the guys for the Lakers can play better, but how much do we really expect them to play better? I don't know. Like, that's kind of the tough part. So now game 2 becomes a must win, or else you're kind of in danger of getting swept again.
Yeah, and a couple things from the Lakers' perspective, like if you look at the box score, and you look at the minute spread, it's kind of intriguing that D'Angelo Russell played the same amount of minutes as LeBron. I think that shows you how much faith they might have had on in D'Lo going into this game, and it might have been misplaced, because the problem is we know that D'Lo, he when he's not going on offense, he's never really going on defense. Steals, cool, but that's not, that doesn't encapsulate the whole picture of defense. But when he's not going on either end of the floor, he is unplayable. So I'm expecting them to kind of lean towards Gabe Vincent and getting him some more minutes, just to potentially do some more damage. But, to his credit, Jamal Murray wasn't really a crazy player this game, and that's because of Austin Reeves and what he was able to do. But, it's just crazy. Like, you have the ideal first half with LeBron James and Anthony Davis doing their thing, looking like a dynamic duo. And then, the third quarter collapse, horrendous. And nobody else showed up, and that's the problem. Whereas you look at the Nuggets, everybody kind of showed up. KCP doing his thing, 40% from the three-point line. You love to see it. Even Jamal Murray, from the three-point line, very good. Jokic, that's kind of a given. And then Michael Porter Jr., the X Factor, showed up, as he probably will the entire series, because I think they're giving him way too many open looks. Like you were even talking about in the live stream. I hate to steal your mojo, but, Aaron Gordon, you're giving him open looks, but why are you giving Porter Jr., KCP, all these guys open looks? They're knockdown shooters. It's unacceptable. And the huge thing for Denver, obviously, to win this game, ball control. They only had 4 turnovers, and you have to credit their offense and just the way that they were able to kind of pick apart the Lakers, especially in the second half. Whereas, the Lakers, they had 12 turnovers. Like you said about LeBron and execution, you have to play mistake-free basketball against Denver, because they're going to run out, score in transition, and you saw that happen a bunch.
Yeah, I mean, Jokic probably had more dunks in this game than he probably has ever had in a game.
Exactly. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, he had like
Running
at
the
least
floor.
like 3 or 4,
Yeah.
even like on the break. Kind of some and again, like with the Lakers, that's the other part, is like when they beat them in the bubble in 2020, they had some additional bigs other than AD, right? Like you had JaVale, you had Dwight Howard, even like a Markieff Morris,
Mm-hmm.
and others, but you don't really have that this time around, right? Like, Christian Wood's hurt. According to Shams, he might be back for game 3. Who knows if he'll play, depending on what condition he's in, considering he had knee surgery. Vanderbilt's obviously out, so you don't really have him at all. That's a guy that could probably help you on the boards and prevent you from playing these super small Torian Prince at the 4 lineups. But you got to roll with what you have, right? Like, there are other teams that are in even worse spots, that don't even have their best players. But, the lack of size is, against the Nuggets is kind of the reason why it's a tough matchup. Because, again, how are you going to, prevent them from getting offensive rebounds? How are you going to prevent them from getting easy looks around the basket? And then, how are you going to prevent the stars from being gassed? Because both LeBron and AD have some pretty significant defensive roles as well. And in addition to them having to be, really, really good on the offensive end as well. And that's kind of the factors. Like, say a guy like LeBron, you could tell in the second half he didn't really have as much, gas left in the tank, which is something to kind of think about. Um, in regards to like what does he do over the course of the series. And that's where it's nice, like when your guards can play well. But if they don't play well, then that's where you're going to lose. Because that pretty much is what it comes down to. Because like we mentioned with Michael Porter Jr., he doesn't necessarily have to play well in order for the Nuggets to win. It's more so when he plays well, they're not going to lose, right?
Exactly.
Assuming everybody else plays well. But for D'Angelo Russell, he's an X factor because you're not going to win if D'Lo plays poorly, right? You're just not. Like you don't have another guy that you can really turn to for some offense. And he changes their offense when he plays well because it's not just his ability to shoot, but it's also his ability to like pass and just make things easier for other guys
It
who
makes it
aren't necessarily
dynamic.
that aren't necessarily creators, right? A guy like a Jackson Hayes, right? Like D'Lo can kind of set him up for some quick dunks if his shots falling and he's on the floor and he actually has to be guarded. But the Nuggets at different points sometimes were kind of just like leaving him open. They were like, we don't even care.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of rough to be in that position. And like you said, we'll see what the other guards do, but game two is a must win. If you don't win that game, that series is pretty much done. Same with most of the other teams. But this one is different because we know the pressure is going to mount. We know, like, mentally, there's going to be a lot of guys that, if they lose game two, they're going to be like, yeah, this is kind of the same script all over again where we just can't beat this team. We've
Right.
lost to them 9 straight times. And if it's 10 straight times, right, like, that's kind of wraps, right?
Yeah.
And that's tough, right? Because in the playoffs, like if you're in the Western Conference, you're probably gonna have to beat the Nuggets to come out of the West. But this is why, to me, it was kind of the worst case scenario to match up with them in the first round, because I understand the argument of you do have more days off for sure. But ideally, I think if you're the Lakers, you'd prefer like somebody else take them out, like because that I think that's probably the one team where I'm saying like you have a very very low chance of beating them. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like I think that because it's not like the Lakers are bad. Like a lot of these other teams, it's not like the Suns are bad. Like all of these teams, even down to the eighth seed, basically have won, almost 50 games, right? Like New Orleans has won 49 games. But, the thing is that, the West is really good and the matchups are important. And this is not a good matchup for the Lakers. And, again, if D'Angelo Russell doesn't play well, you're going home. If
Yeah.
he doesn't have one, like, there's not going to be a single game that the Lakers win where D'Lo plays poorly. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And if he plays poorly in every game, they're going to lose literally every game.
Yep. That's the recipe for success for them.
Yeah. And then moving on to day two. Day two was a lot uglier. A lot of blowouts. We did have one good game, but we'll go in the order that they aired. Celtics Heat. This one sucked.
Yeah.
From a viewing standpoint. This was the one. If you had something else to do, you go do it. You don't watch this game. You don't act like it's on. You just pretend like it didn't exist.
Yep.
Obviously, you give credit to Boston. They destroyed Miami in this game, 114-94, which is what we expected. I think this is the series that's probably the most likely one to be a sweep because it's just a complete mismatch in terms of talent. For Miami, no Jimmy Butler, no Terry Rozier, so you don't have a point guard. You're down your best offensive player. It's tough. Like, you just don't really have much of an answer, for what Boston can do. You don't really have the size to limit a guy like Porzingis. You don't really have the athletes to limit what guys like Tatum and Brown can necessarily do. And the Celtics are gonna, if you play zone against them, they do shoot a lot of threes and they make a lot of them. They're, one of the best 3-point shooting teams pretty much ever, at least as far as the regular season goes. Pretty much everybody in their rotation, can basically be a 40% 3-point shooter at any point. Other than I guess like, who's the worst 3-point shooter in the group? Probably Jaylen Brown.
Yeah.
And like if he's your worst 3-point shooter, that's a really good jump shooting team.
Mm-hmm.
So, we saw in this game why Boston, is going to be the favorite in the Eastern Conference and why they do have a good shot at winning the title, right? We didn't pick them to win the title, but they are a very good team. They are a historically great regular season team. And this is a statement win, right? We talked about it in the live stream that they were probably going to blow the Heat out to send the message like, hey, we know what happened last year. This isn't the same as last year. Obviously, the Heat are overmatched, so there's not really a whole lot they can do. They did cut it to, a more respectable 13-point deficit, but Celtics, clearly took their foot off the gas. Obviously, you had the little scuffle with Tatum and Martin, but not really too much there. Glad that there wasn't a major injury, right? Like honestly, they probably shouldn't have even really been in the game.
Yeah.
But
It was a
either way,
statement, like you were saying.
yeah. But either way, yeah, it was a statement win. So the Celtics are going to win this series, right? And they've pretty much got the best case scenario where it's like they avoid Philly in the first round. They play, the other end of the bracket, right? Where they're going to play either Cleveland or Orlando, right? So they don't even have to face a team like Milwaukee potentially until the conference finals. Cleveland and Orlando, I don't think are any match for Boston. So if you're the Celtics, this is pretty much the best case scenario where it's like the two best players in the Eastern Conference are both either injured or compromised, and you have an easier bracket. So you have to make the finals, and they probably will make the finals because
Right.
I think they're the best team in the East. And unless Embiid gets healthy or Giannis is healthy and the Bucks start clicking, which maybe they'll do because we'll talk about it in a moment. I don't see a real reason for why the Celtics shouldn't come out of the East unless, knock on wood, some catastrophic injury occurs, which we don't want to see. We don't
Yeah.
want any more injuries.
Yeah, exactly. And, everybody's, pretty much firing on all cylinders in this game, which is exactly what you would kind of expect. It's a mismatch pretty much at every position at this point. Even with Jimmy Butler in the lineup, it would probably be a mismatch, which is kind of tough if you really think about it. I think, if Jimmy Butler is here, it's still probably, going to be an obliteration at this point just because of the talent level that Boston does have. And then you look at the bench guys, they showed up, they showed out, they were efficient as they have been the entire season. You got Sam Hauser being one of the best 3-point shooters in the league. And yeah, you really can't go wrong here if you're Boston. And like you said, there's not really much to talk about because it reminds me of like the old matchups we used to get, when we were younger, where, 1 versus 8 was pretty much a wash, in most cases.
Right? Yeah, because the talent level was different, and the one
Mm-hmm.
seed was
Yeah.
on another level.
Yep.
And yeah, like you said, it's closer to this. Obviously the injuries is a factor, but
Yeah.
you know, unfortunately, sometimes that's what happens, right? Like, just unfortunately, every year there's always at least a couple of key guys in the playoffs that get hurt, and it always changes the course of the postseason
Yeah.
for literally every team, right? Like, Giannis was hurt last year, right? And I think that obviously was a major shakeup in the Eastern Conference because the Bucks were looked at as the favorites to come out of the East, and I think they were looked at really as the favorites to win it all.
Yes, they were.
Uh,
They were that good.
they ended up going out in the first round, mainly because Giannis got hurt, but
Yep.
also you still give credit to the Heat, but still.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, and that's the rough for the Heat because, again, you're without your best guys. You just don't have enough. And that's
Yeah.
kind of what this series is. Not really much to talk about there.
Yeah.
Um, then moving on, Mavs Clippers, another decimation. This was one that I think caught us by surprise because I know in the live stream, we both picked the Mavs to win this game and this series. My main reason for picking the Mavs to win was really only because I didn't know what was going on with Kawhi. Before Kawhi got hurt, I was kind of expecting the Clippers to win the series because I think they're the better team and they're more talented. Um, but it was kind of wild, right? No Kawhi, and the Clippers ended up running away with this game. It was 109-97, but the final score did not indicate how this game was. This was basically a 20 plus point game for most of the game.
Yeah.
On the Clipper side, pretty much you got contributions out of everybody. Harden was great, 28 points, 8 assists, 2 blocks. And that's really the key here, right? He's the X factor for the Clippers. When he plays well, generally the Clippers win. Um, and he turned back the clock with this type of performance, right? The thing is with Harden is we saw this kind of last year with Philly, right? Where he had some big games for Philly where his jump shot was falling because that's kind of what it is for him now. He's not quite as consistent at getting to the rim anymore. So he's really more of a perimeter oriented guy. So when his shot is falling, right, and the step back threes are going in, that's where he still looks really good. And he can obviously pass very well. But when the shots aren't falling, right, like we saw in some of those games in the Philly series last year, that's where he looks closer to being like a shell of himself. Um, and obviously, you got contributions from other guys. Terrence Mann had 13 points and 9 rebounds, including 4 offensive boards. Zubac basically looked like the best center in the league at 20 points, 15 rebounds, 1 steal, 1 block. Destroyed the Mavs bigs. Right, they
Yeah.
looked like their front court was a major problem. They looked like they did not belong. Um, Paul George had 22 and 6. Some of that I think was like when the game was kind of like already out of reach, right? Like, and he was kind of just adding on to the, point total because it got like kind of close. Not in the sense that you thought the Mavs were going to win, but they did cut into the lead and then he put it back away.
Yeah.
But still, he did contribute. And then Westbrook off the bench was great. 13 points, 4 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals. played great defense, even hit some jumpers, which is kind of a key, right? The more jumpers he hits, I think the more playable he is, especially if he's also defending well. Because you didn't even need Norman Powell to do a whole lot. And that's kind of the key here, is that the Clippers, I think, just have more good players. Um, but it did kind of shock me because I did expect the Mavs to come out and win game one, and they looked awful, right? They were playing great basketball. A lot of people thought championship level basketball for the better part of the All-Star break, but they looked bad here. Like they were very bad in this game. Kyrie and Luka had 31 and 33, respectively, but Luka was 11 for 26, and some of that was like when the game was already over. They did not play very well to start the game, um, but at the same time, their supporting cast was also even worse, right? Like they had multiple important guys in the rotation really not do anything, right? Like Derek Jones Jr. had 0 points, did have 2 blocks, but 0 for 4 from the field. Daniel Gafford 0 rebounds, which I think is the most surprising one. 3 points. Washington was okay, 11.7 boards, 2 steals, 1 block. But if he's the only front court guy that plays well, that's a major problem. Lively was bad. They were kind of forced into playing Maxi Kleber a lot because the bigs were just so bad that they had to get like somebody out there who could space the floor and like because Luka and Kyrie were basically just getting shut out,
Yeah.
for large stretches of the game, especially in the first half. Dante Exum didn't really do much. Hardaway Jr. didn't really do much, and that's the problem for the Mavs. That it's a 3-point oriented team, kind of like the Clippers, but their guys but their individual players aren't necessarily as good. So like when the threes aren't falling for the other guys, it becomes very difficult for Dallas because then it's basically just Luka and Kyrie, and even Luka at different points kind of was just going 1-on-5. Um, Only had he had 6 assists, which I guess is fine, but 4 turnovers, which is not great. And I think in the next game, those two guys are gonna have to be better earlier in the game, but also the supporting cast needs to be better because if the supporting cast is just gonna be basically like just not really a factor at all, then it's gonna be a lot easier to slow down Luka and Kyrie. So it's kind of a double edged sword, kind of like things go hand in hand. If the supporting cast plays better, it makes it easier on the stars, but the stars also have to play better if they want a chance to win the series. Um, it's a statement win for the Clippers, and not one that we really expected. But they do have, I think, more the better supporting cast. Because again, Kawhi's out, but basically Harden was able to kind of not that he replicated the Kawhi production, but he gave you like superstar production in this game.
Yeah.
Right? Like if Harden's gonna be basically the best player on the floor, like you're gonna win the game.
Yeah, and that's why they brought him in. He did his job. They knew there was a vacancy, and he stepped up and did a lot more. He scored and made plays, and I think that's the key for the Clippers. Whereas the Dallas Mavericks, I didn't see a lick of team basketball in this game. I don't think and that's no offense to Kyrie and Luka because they're amazing in their own ways. But I'm really talking about the other guys. Zubac was bullying Gafford from the jump. It was really bad. I was very confused, but at the same time, kind of brought me back to, Gafford's Wizards days where I was like, okay, yeah, he does struggle against, bigger guys, taller guys, tends to kind of get bullied and then boom, foul trouble. And then obviously same thing with Lively. He's a rookie. You don't really expect too much from him going into a series like this. But then, look at the Clippers. Paul George, great fourth quarter, I think. And like I said, Harden, he had a great game, and that's what you really need from him. Not like night in, night out, but I think you need it if Kawhi's not going to be available. And I'm highly doubtful that he's going to be playing in game 2. So I think Harden's going to need to replicate that again. Westbrook, you love the intensity, everything off the bench. Terrence Mann, I think going 3 for 3 is a big deal as well from the 3-point line. They just came out firing. Like you said, it was a blowout from the jump. And I think this was probably the biggest statement of, the weekend because I don't think anybody really expected this. Everybody was chatting, talking about it, no Kawhi equals Mavericks easy win, something along those lines. But they came out, showed their identity, showed us how good they looked at the beginning of the season and, even towards, I guess part of the end of the season. But going into the playoffs, there were a lot of questions about how this team would perform. Huge win, but still, I think it's still a reminder, not first to 1, first to 4.
And that's the thing you were kind of thinking like at a certain point because people were really starting to lean towards Dallas, and you kind of maybe wondered at one point, was there a letdown coming? And this is kind of what basically ended up happening, right? Because the Clippers, for a good chunk of the year, were the better team.
Yeah.
Um, but then post All Star break, the defense really disappeared. But it showed up in this game combined with the offense, and that's really like for the Clippers what you need. If the defense is there, then that's going to allow the Clippers to win the series because I just don't think the Mavs, even though they've been much better defensively,
Hmm.
I don't necessarily think they have the personnel to be able to slow down, all of the Clippers guys because it's like, who's guarding Harden, who's guarding Paul George when Kawhi comes back, who's guarding him, and that's the tough part, right? Because like in the starting group, Luca and Kyrie is basically your backcourt, but because the Clippers, when they're healthy, have three really talented offensive players, one of those guys is probably going to at times have to guard, Harden or Paul George or Kawhi. And that happened at times in this game, right? Like Harden at times had like a Luca switched on him and he took advantage, right? Or Paul George had Kyrie on him at different points and he took advantage. And that's kind of the rough part, for the Mavs that like your two stars are not great defensively. They will compete at times,
Hmm.
right? But that's not really what they do. And
Right.
especially like with huge offensive asks that they have, you're just not always going to get that sometimes. And that's really the difference. It's going to come down to the role players for the Mavs. If they step up and play better, then that's going to allow Kyrie and Luca to, I think get some, easier stuff going because then you have to pay attention to the other players. But if it doesn't happen, it's going to be tough. But like you said, it is the first to four. And you still need Kawhi to come back, I think, at some point. I think it's just going to be really difficult to beat the Clippers, to win the series without Kawhi playing at all. Maybe they can pull it off if Harden plays like this. But I feel like there is going to be like, a letdown game coming from him.
Yeah.
But you do kind of wonder, like, who's going to be guarding him that's going to be able to slow him down because
Yeah.
that is kind of a question. Maybe Josh Green plays more. Maybe he slides into the starting five if Derek Jones Jr. starts to just kind of disappear. That's kind of the only really thing I can really think of.
Yeah, and the Clippers, they said, that they were buying Kawhi some time, and that's exactly what they kind of did. Giving him a little bit of flexibility and leeway to come back a little bit later, if possible. So you could tell they're really fighting for this, and they want to advance. And I think that's kind of a different kind of level that we've seen from the Clippers. I guess better than previous iterations where, maybe the focus wasn't, the chip at the time.
Right. Yeah, because at different points in the season, they were very locked in.
Yeah.
And they kind of went away. But if it comes back and they can find their mojo, they do have a chance to really do something.
Yeah, they could be
If they
elite.
stay healthy, that's just the issue is do we trust Kawhi to be healthy if he's not even healthy right now? I don't know about that.
Because I'd be curious to see, how a Clippers could match up against Denver potentially. Like a healthy Kawhi, healthy PG, good Harden, Zubac. I think that would be a very good matchup for Denver.
And that's what we thought we were gonna get
Yeah,
with the way they were playing earlier in the season, but then it just kind of fell apart. But we'll see. We may
yeah,
have a chance, but if it happens, it wouldn't be until the conference finals because of how the
absolutely.
bracket ended up being. Um, and then we move on. Game one of the Pacers Bucks. This was another, I think, kind of surprising result from a lot of people because kind of like what happened with the Clippers. I think a lot of people were kind of leaning towards the Pacers to win. There were a lot of people because of the regular season success the Pacers had against the Bucks that were picking them anyways.
Yeah, that was
Um,
me.
yeah, like before Giannis got hurt, I picked the Bucks to win. When they were talking about Giannis probably not playing, then that kind of made me lean towards Indiana. But like with Giannis, I thought the Bucks were better. And in this game, they kind of showed that, right? Obviously, it is one game. The big thing obviously was Dame turning back the clock, right? Like he had a vintage performance, 35 points, all of which was in the first half. 0 points in the second half, but they didn't really need him in the second half because they got things from other guys. Middleton had 23, Portis had 15, Brooke Lopez had 11, Beasley had 9, and that was kind of enough, right? Um, you know, Lillard led the way, made a lot of really tough shots. The Pacers did a good job defensively in the regular season, but in this game, he did make a lot of those tough shots that, probably were some similar shots that they were guarding and doing a good job of in the regular season. And that's kind of the tough thing with a guy like Lillard is he is a tough shot maker. This is kind of why you trade for Damian Lillard if you're Milwaukee to have games like this. Obviously, you would like Giannis to be available, but because of the offensive firepower that Lillard is still capable of at times. That's why you get a guy like that. Because we saw what happened last year where, the offense really bogged down towards the end of the games because other than Giannis, you didn't really have another guy you could easily turn to for offense, right? Middleton wasn't really the same because he was battling injuries. And Holiday, just isn't that type of offensive player. But now you have a guy in Lillard that can get his own shot and that can pretty much score from anywhere. Because we saw at different points, right? There was a lot of tough jumpers, some drives to the rim, drawing fouls. He had 7 free throws, and that was really all you needed. Then you look over on Indiana's side, they looked like a deer in the headlights, as we talked about in the live stream, where it looked like it was their first playoff game that a lot of these guys had ever played in. The
Hmm.
only one that looked relatively comfortable was Pascal Siakam, and that's because he's been in playoff games before, including a championship one, right? McConnell was okay, right? I think he was, easily the best of their point guards, which is a problem, right? Halliburton wasn't really good in this game.
Yeah.
9 points, 8 assists, 7 rebounds, just wasn't really effective. 1 of 3 from three. Only took 7 shots, which is just kind of wild, right? Like, I mean, Miles Turner took 17 shots, which, again, you know, I guess you got to fire, but like, ideally, it's kind of like what we talked about with D'Angelo Russell. Like, he probably just shouldn't be taking, that many shots in a game compared to some of the other guys on the team just because of who he is, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I'd feel
That
better about like a Tyrese Halliburton 5 for 17 game than I would a Miles Turner one. And that's not saying like a whole lot, but
Yeah, exactly, right? Like he just didn't look comfortable out there. He looked kind of rattled. Looked like he, was kind of first game playoff first game jitters, right? That's kind of what it seemed like. For the most part, from a lot of guys on the team, not
yeah,
just Halliburton. But if Halliburton is limited, that's where it's going to be really tough for Indiana, right? We know they're a great offensive team, but we also know this is the playoffs, right? Indiana, a big part of their offense is the three. Not that that's the only thing they do, but it is a big part of it. And they shot 21% from three. A
yeah,
lot of them were open. So, it wasn't like Milwaukee played stifling perimeter defense. It happened at times for sure. But there were a lot of wide open looks created, and Halliburton did create some open looks, and they missed a lot, right? He would have had more assists if the threes had fallen. Aaron Neesmith, 2 of 9, 1 for 7 from three. Siakam was 1 for 4, but you don't complain because he, scored pretty much everywhere else.
hmm,
Miles Turner, 3 for 9 from three. McConnell, 0 of 3 from three. They just left him wide open. They didn't even care. Obi Toppin, 0 for 4. Ben Shepherd, 1 for 4. And that's the wild part. They played 11 guys, I think, in the first half, which you just don't normally see in the playoffs from a serious team because normally in the playoffs, you know who you're going to play. And like 11 guys is a lot for a playoff game. Unless you have like the deepest team ever, which this team is not,
yeah,
like that shouldn't happen. And I think part of that is also just they didn't really know who to turn to. I
yeah. They were
mean,
scrambling.
yeah, like Isaiah Jackson would come in for 2 minutes. Doug McDermott would have like two shifts where he would play like 2, 3 minutes.
Yeah,
Ben Shepherd just comes out of nowhere, right? Like it was just kind of weird. Like it didn't really make a lot of sense.
yeah,
Obviously, without Matherin, you do lose some offensive punch, right? Like that is a guy that can, kind of attack the basket and not just fire from three. That probably also kind of limits what you can really do on offense. But again, the threes are going to have to fall, right? That's kind of the first step. So we'll see what they do in the next game, right? Because obviously the same threes that they were left open on may go in. But this is kind of the problem with teams that are kind of, you know, very, very, very reliant on 3-point shooting. Like it's, I think earlier in the season, I kind of referred to Indiana as sort of like Sacramento of the Eastern Conference. And it
hmm,
is different, right? Because Halliburton's a different player from Fox, but it feels very similar, where it's like just the things that they can do in the regular season offensively just don't seem to translate to playoff basketball. It is one game, so it might be too early to put that label on there, but this was not really, I think, what you would have expected if you picked Indiana to win the series. And they're gonna have to respond in a big way. I mean, I think to be fair, you don't expect Indiana to win both games in Milwaukee, right? Milwaukee is a team that's had multiple playoff runs, including a championship run, and a lot of those same guys are still there. So that's something you have to factor in. But now game two becomes a must win, I think, for Indiana, ideally. I mean, if you go home and you protect home court, that's cool. but you have to win 4 games, and you only get 3 in Indiana. So you're gonna have to steal at least one in Milwaukee, and I think ideally it's one of the first 2 games. So not the end of the world. And to be fair, they limited Lillard in the second half, but I mean it was like a 30-point deficit in the first half, which
Yeah.
in the playoffs, it's not like the regular season. It is very difficult to come back from that big of a deficit in the playoffs because we just know playoff basketball is usually a slower pace. It's not as up and down. And so that means there's just fewer possessions. The scoring is obviously lower, as we've seen. You're not gonna see too many 135, 140 point games like we saw in the regular season. You're gonna get games like these where like one team scores like 110, and then like another team may score like 98, or
Yeah.
or something like that. Like we see, these are the type of blowouts you're gonna see. You're not gonna see like 145 to 104. You're just not going to. That's just not how playoff basketball is.
Yeah. And, as somebody who picked, the Pacers to win this series, I can say, this was not what I expected at all. Halliburton, I think that was the main thing that really kind of just caught me off guard outside of the fact that Lillard completely took over the game and ended the game pretty much at halftime. That was the big thing as well. But, Tyrese Halliburton's got to match that energy, or at least attempt to. 7 shots from him is pretty dark, if you ask me. I think that's way too little. I don't like that usage rate at all. I think that's way too low for a guy of his caliber. And I really just want to hope and chalk it up to, lack of playoff experience, and I want to kind of group them with the Magic, where it's like, hopefully they can find their footing, but it might be too late by the time that they do, which is fair, because I don't think that a lot of people would say Indiana is in a must-win scenario where they need to win the championship this year or they're done or something like that. They have a lot of room to grow, and I think this could be a huge step in the right direction, if they actually do win the series. And I think you're primed to do that without Giannis. That's the factor. Like, if Giannis was there, I'd say it's a much harder task, but stuff is kind of lining up in your favor, and you might be squabbling the opportunity. But yeah, Siakam, he did his thing, but outside of that, I don't know how to feel about Halliburton. I know somebody in our chat, I think it was Homelander, he called him overrated. I don't think he's overrated, but I think, he's going to need to adjust and come out a lot stronger in game 2, which I think he will. But, it's kind of interesting to look at like some superstars that have been playing in these matchups, and you look at Anthony Edwards. That's kind of how I want Halliburton to respond. Obviously, completely different games and completely different play styles, but I think Halliburton can do a lot, from his playmaking, and then also rain down a lot of threes, just get guys open, and then it opens up the floor for defense as well. So I think there is an opportunity for them to still win the series. I don't think it's over, but not a good start for them.
I wonder, because we've talked about at different points with Halliburton, where it's like during the latter part of the season, he just hasn't physically looked the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think Milwaukee's defense did kind of, do a good job in terms of like limiting his impact and kind of just making him more uncomfortable
Yeah.
than I think he would have expected. But again, the difference between how he played the first half of the season and the second half of the season is just stark, right? Like in the first half of the season, he looked like, honestly, like a top 5, you know, top 10, player in the NBA.
Yeah. I thought he was
right?
the best point guard in the NBA at that time.
Yeah, but since that injury, he just hasn't looked the same, right? Even in some of the games that the Pacers have won, like he'll have like certain those, some of those games from time to time or like moments, but not a lot of games where like from start to finish he looked like how he looked like earlier in the season. So maybe that's a factor that we don't necessarily know about.
Mm-hmm.
Not making excuses, but that could potentially be it. And it also is probably just a combination of that plus it's playoff basketball. Like
Yeah.
in the playoffs, there's more attention to detail. You're playing one team over the course of a couple of weeks, so you have way more time to game plan and kind of come up with strategies for how to slow down these other guys.
Yeah.
And again, and it comes down to the stars, right? Like in this game, Damian Lillard was the best player on the floor. And Halliburton needs to be the best player on the floor if the Pacers want to win the series, particularly if Giannis is not out there, right? You know what I mean? Because like you don't
Absolutely.
expect Halliburton to be the best player if Giannis is on the floor. We've seen, Giannis score 60 points against this team because we know this team is not that great defensively. It's been better, right? Obviously, but it didn't look that amazing in this game. But to be fair, Lillard did hit some tough shots, and he did have 0 points in the second half. But again, sometimes what you try to take away, you give to other stuff. It's like what we talked about in the other series, where it's like, okay, you're blitzing and trapping Lillard in the second half, but it creates opportunities for Middleton. It creates opportunities for Portis. It's kind of just, pick your poison, right?
Yeah.
Like, would you rather Lillard do what he did in the first half, or would you rather somebody else beat you, right? And it's kind of just, a difference in basketball philosophy for a lot of coaches, because there's going to be some where it's like, we'll just let Lillard go one on one and just try to force him into hitting tough shots. And sometimes you just need the personnel, right? Like it was Nemhart who was guarding Lillard. Didn't really work in this game, right? You know, but then, say for like another team that maybe has different types of personnel, sometimes that can work. So we'll see what the Pacers cook up in game two. And I
Yeah.
think part of it is a better rotation, like a more solid rotation in terms of like who are you actually going to play and put out there. But it was tough because, like, honestly, there were times where like guys were out there and it's like this guy probably shouldn't be playing, but he almost has to play because you can't play your starters 48 minutes. So we'll see
Exactly.
what happens. Jarvis Walker, does he play at all?
No, I don't think he will. He didn't play that much in the regular season, but like even like with the Bucks, like even thinking about it, I said it in the live stream. I was very quick to forget, how good Damian Lillard really is in the playoffs. It's just we haven't really seen him in the playoffs in a long time, and the sample size is a little bit smaller. But this is a very competitive Milwaukee Bucks roster. I think this is the best team that Dame has ever been on. So I think that factor is definitely a thing that I didn't take into account. And I think a lot of people didn't as well, because I don't care what it is. 35 points at half is insane.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. We don't take away from, even though he had zero in the second half, like
Yeah.
if he doesn't do what he does in the first half, they probably don't win that game.
Hmm.
So that's kind of, and again, like you talked about it, right? Where you mentioned, like, yeah, I had gone to Coachella,
Yeah,
like the last,
Coachella. Yeah.
yeah, because I wasn't in the playoffs, and now thank goodness I don't have to do that
Yeah.
again. Right, because and last year he was really good, and I think part of the concern that people had was a lot of people thought that his season individually was not as good as it was last year, where the efficiency was down. But I think I had talked about the idea of like, what if in the playoffs all of a sudden he just kind of has some turn back the clock performances, and if he does, that makes the Bucks a much more dangerous team, because you need both Giannis and Lillard to play at a high level. That's what makes
Yeah.
it work.
Absolutely.
But again, it's one game, right? He could all of a sudden in the next game not really play all that well, and then we're kind of back to square one. But it really depends, because that's if you're the Bucks, these type of games are what you got him for. If he can put up these type of games more often, the Bucks are going to do better than I think what people expect, right? Like
Yeah.
it will be easier to match up against a team like the Celtics if you get this version of Damian Lillard. But a team like Boston also has personnel that's probably better suited to slow down Dame than a team like Indiana, which just
Yeah.
doesn't have the same type of guys.
Yep.
And then moving on, the final game of day two, right? The best game, at different points it got kind of nasty, right? But this was definitely a back and forth game where you really didn't know who was going to win, unlike the first two games, unlike the first three games where the game was over after like 5 minutes.
You're right.
But this one, back and forth, OKC versus New Orleans. This, I think, was one that we kind of expected to be a very tough and very compelling series. And OKC pulled it off 94-92. The big story was really what was OKC going to look like in the playoffs for the first time, right? It was the first time in 5 years that they've had a playoff game in this arena, right? The last time they were in the playoffs was in the bubble, right? So they were in Orlando, not in Oklahoma City. The fans showed out. It was loud. It was raucous in a good way,
Hmm.
right? They drowned out the commentators. Every time OKC made a big play, they went nuts, which was great to see, right? Because this is, this is a fan base that at one point was used to seeing consistently good basketball, right? Because at one point you had Harden, you had Durant, you had Westbrook, you had Ibaka, and they went to the finals. You know, kind of fell off after that. I think mainly due to injuries and because they let Harden go.
Yeah.
But either way, they were a perennial playoff team. From the beginning to the end, and now they're back. Except it's a different big three this time around, right? Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, right? He led the way with 28, 6-4. This was his first playoff game as the guy because he's been in the playoffs before. He was on that OKC bubble team, but he wasn't a superstar.
Hmm.
And it was kind of interesting to see in this game, right? Chet Holmgren had 15 and 11 with 5 blocks, right? He started off slow, but got into it as they went along. Jalen Williams had 19, 7, and 4 with 2 steals, 8 of 18 from the field, 1 of 5. But like you said in this live stream, brought the energy. Lou Dort did a great job defensively on Ingram. Giddy wasn't great, but that's where Cason Wallace comes in, with the 3 and D, made a couple of shots and had the key defensive play at the end of the game where he shut down McCollum and forced him into a really tough contested leaning 3, to win the game. But really, and that was kind of the key here was OKC won this game for the most part with their defense, right? They were like offensively, this was a low scoring game, right? This was what 94 to 92.
Yeah.
Neither team scored 100 points. And it's kind of interesting because both of these teams are kind of some of the better two-way teams in the league, right? OKC was a top 5 offense and defensive team. New Orleans, I think, is a better defensive team than offensive team. And obviously, without Zion, it's a tall task because it's tough to replace a guy that does what he does on the offensive end of the floor because he's their best player.
Yeah.
Really, you look around with OKC, it was interesting how over the course of the game, it felt like they were getting more comfortable. But then the offense in the fourth bogged down. They went 5 minutes without scoring. And even Shea, right, at times looked kind of overwhelmed, right, where he was turning the ball over. Some of the tough shots that he was taking that would go in the regular season all of a sudden weren't going in because New Orleans put some size and length on him. Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, they did a great job. But then he made a couple of big plays, right? He made a big shot, to tie it, and then I think he made the and one or whatever, to put him up right by 3. The tough leaning, contested
layup.
floater over CJ McCollum.
Yeah.
Right. Seemed like kind of like he threw it up, but again, he's a tough shot maker. And you want a guy like that in the playoffs. When your offense bogs down and you can get it to your best player, he can get you a tough shot, and that's what you want, right? So, step 1 for OKC was win this game, right? And they won this game. Even, a couple of the bench guys, right? Like Aaron Wiggins had a couple of big plays, including an and one. Jalen Williams, right? The backup big hit, a couple of threes, including a big one in the fourth quarter. And that's kind of a key there is like Oklahoma City, very reliant on 3-point shooting at times, right? From guys other than Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. Shot 31%, which isn't great, right? Because they were a very good 3-point shooting team for most of the year. But again, we know in the playoffs, 3-point shooting is hard to come by. Only 13 free throws as a team, right? Shea Gilgeous-Alexander had 7, 6 of 7. And that's going to be something to kind of look at too, because he's a guy that lives at the free throw line. So what does the playoff officiating look like? And at one point, it looked like they were about to kind of give this game away to New Orleans. And then New Orleans basically gave the game back to Oklahoma City. Some of the crunch time stuff from New Orleans was awful. I mean, they had the stretch where they got 4 chances at it. I don't think a single one of those shots were good at all, including like the Ingram like fall away 3.
Oh yeah, that was horrible. Yeah, didn't that hit the side of the backboard? If I'm not mistaken.
I don't even remember at that point. Like they were all awful shots. Like
you're right.
It was just bad. And Ingram really did struggle in this game. He was 5 of 17. But despite that, Trey Murphy was great. Got a little shot happy, but he did shoot 5 of 12 from 3, which is good, and did play good defense. He was part of that grouping that really made it hard for SGA at 3 blocks. And that's kind of the difference when you insert him for Zion, is you get more 3-point shooting and floor spacing, but you don't have quite as much rim pressure, which I think New Orleans did kind of miss, right? Because Zion against a team like Oklahoma City, you would think could be a problem because of the fact that Oklahoma City doesn't really have like a second big physical guy to kind of throw at him. But Chet did do his job in terms of blocks. Valanciunas had 20 boards, which was insane, including 9 offensive rebounds. Herb Jones played great defense, but his offense was bad. And he did have a lot of good looks. I think his was one that definitely hit the side of the backboard.
Yeah.
At one point, it was a little too much CJ McCollum, which is going to be the issue when you don't have Zion. I mean, he wasn't terrible, right? He was fine. 9 of 22, 40% from the field, 2 of 9 from 3, 22%. But you need Zion. And that's kind of the tough part where it's like, that's probably where you're going to lose the series. Because I think if he was healthy, like we said that like if Zion was healthy, this could be a 6-7 game series. And New Orleans could potentially pull off the upset because they have had playoff experience before. And they have, I think, more good players than Oklahoma City does, like just more depth. When a guy like Trey Murphy is starting because Zion is out, but then he comes off the bench, if Zion is there, that's pretty nuts. Like New Orleans second unit, I think, especially defensively, is really good, right? Alvarado, even Najee Marshall had a couple of moments. Nance off the bench was solid until the end, right? He had a couple of rough possessions where he got an offensive board and gave it to Trey Murphy, who was out of
Yeah,
bounds.
that was a huge brain fart. I couldn't believe it. Trey Murphy's face was like a meme, dude. It was so funny.
Yeah, and then he had the play where he had like the finger roll, and then Chet just kind of just
Yeah,
swatted it.
yeah. That
It
was
kept
not
it in
right.
play. Yeah, and that was kind of the rough part was you like both teams were trying to give the game away. But at the end of the day, Oklahoma City, I just, they had the best guy on the floor, I think. And that
Closer.
kind of made it different. Yeah, that kind of made the difference. They had a true closer, and like with New Orleans, if Ingram is gonna be 5 of 17 and is gonna get shut out of the series for the most part, I don't think Oklahoma City. I don't think New Orleans really has a chance to win. They only lost by 2 with Ingram having a bad game. So I guess in a way that's kind of a positive you can look at. But they did a really good job of guarding him defensively. Now because the only shots he really made were kind of like these end of the clock heaves where it's like that's just a tough shot,
Yeah.
right? And he is a tough shot maker, but a lot of his other shots were just like really forced and just not really within the flow of the offense. He had a couple of breakaways, I think, but he just, I know his plus minus was +1, but I thought he was just bad. Like, you
I,
know what I mean? I thought he was like, I thought he was easily the worst of the starters in that group. Um, and I think, his play kind of was really the difference between them winning and losing. Because if he has an average game, I think New Orleans actually would have won this game. Because they
yeah.
only lost by 2 points. But, again, when you don't have Zion, it kind of forces everybody up into a role that they're probably just not suited for, right? It forces McCollum into being like kind of the primary ball handler and decision maker as opposed to a lot of possessions where the ball's in Zion's hands. And that's just not what you really want if you're New Orleans. And again, it's not those guys' faults. It's not anybody's fault, right? Zion got hurt. He can't control that. But it puts him in a bad spot where it kind of, it slots everybody into, situations where it just makes it look a lot more difficult, which is rough. Like, there's just not a whole lot you can do about that.
Yeah, and it's like I credit, Lou Dort for his defense on Brandon Ingram. I think, he made him uncomfortable the entire game, forcing him into, spin shots, air balls even. Great defense. And likewise from, Herb Jones and Trey Murphy, where, they're making Shea feel the heat, which is something that he doesn't normally feel. And also another thing that I'm concerned about with Shea, how is he going to adjust potentially to playoff officiating? I saw him looking for a lot of calls that he probably would have gotten in the regular season, but since we're in the playoffs and, sometimes we just got to play, that can't happen. And I think he'll adjust. They'll look at the film and all that stuff. But regardless, I think, OKC, I think they're a more well put together team at this point without, when we're looking at the New Orleans Pelicans without Zion, of course. You can see there's a lot of chemistry. J Dub is their heart and soul, and that's exactly what happened when he came alive. The entire arena did, and everybody else kind of fed off of that. I was very surprised that the Pelicans, that Valanciunas was actually a factor. That was something that was intriguing to me. I didn't think that he would, actually show up, and he did his job. He had the 20 rebounds, which is nuts. I don't care who you are. 20 rebounds is wild, playoffs or not. But yeah, I'm looking at Brandon Ingram. He's got to have a better game, and it's tough because Dort is an amazing defender. And even CJ McCollum, he's got to have a really good game too. But it's hard when the two best defenders on OKC are on you.
Yeah. And you have to factor in he's recently coming back from injury, so that's the other factor too. Because like you're already down Zion, then you're having an Ingram who probably needed more time, to come back. But he had to, right, in order for them to really, make the playoffs. And he did. He had the good playing game against the Kings. He just hasn't, to me, looked the same since he's come back from injury. But at the same time, like you said, you do give credit to Oklahoma City because they definitely were very physical. And that's kind of what you would have to do with Brandon Ingram,
Yeah,
right? Where it's like, he's a guy with a lot of length and a lot of skill. But he, even though he's not quite as skinny as he was when he was a rookie, he's still kind of like a naturally lanky guy.
yeah,
And that's kind of what you would have to do. You'd have to put a guy who's a lot more physical and a lot more sturdy, like a Lou Dort, right?
yeah,
Like that Lou Dort is normally the guy that they trust on the other team's best offensive player, right?
yep.
And with a guy like Ingram, you're kind of playing into Oklahoma City's hands when you're trying to do that kind of stuff because you're not going to be able to move Lou Dort, right? He's like basically built like a brick.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like in a good way.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like
Yeah,
he's
exactly.
strong as heck, dude. Like it's insane. And yeah, they force him into horrible situations. I mean, at times I really felt like really bad for Ingram because of the situations that he was in. Obviously, you could say he dribbled himself into those situations. Obviously, there are times when you look at Ingram's game and you could ask the what if question, where you question, what if this guy was an elite playmaker? I think his game would be elevated and he would elevate the Pelicans to extreme levels. Although in this game, he had, oh, never mind. I looked at his rebounds, but yeah, he had 3 assists, 2 turnovers. So yeah, that kind of goes with my logic where you're looking at him. What if he is, or what if he could be a better playmaker? I think their ceiling would be a lot higher, because there were a lot of shots he didn't need to take. But I get it. When you're the number one guy, when Zion is out, you feel the pressure to perform and show up and carry the load. But if Dort is on you and he's making you feel the heat, I just don't think it's the right decision to force it up. And same thing with McCollum. I think as great as he played, for the majority of the game, that fourth quarter was very interesting. It's mainly the closing minutes. Give him his credit. He did cut it to 1, but then that game winning attempt was very rough. And I get it, you didn't have a lot of time, but that just kind of shows you what kind of identity the OKC Thunder have, especially defensively. So it's going to be a
Yeah.
wild series, though.
Yeah, because that's really where I think OKC won the game, was at the defensive end. And
Yeah.
that's really the difference there. It wasn't really the offense,
Oh,
because you look around and there were a lot of guys that didn't really have a great offensive performance. I mean,
yeah.
like not bad, but you know what I mean. Like Chet Holmgren was 6 for 14, which isn't actually bad, right? One
Right.
more make, that's 50%. Josh Giddey was 1 for 6. But a lot of them, like in terms of their efficiency, was lower than what they were doing in the regular season,
Right.
right? Like Jalen Williams in the regular season shot like well over 40% from 3.
Yeah.
But in this game, he was 1 for 5, right? Shea Gilgeous-Alexander shot above 50% from the field, right? But in this game, he was like 46, and a couple of those were like, I don't
And
even
he
know.
didn't even
Like,
hit his average for points,
right, exactly. So, that's the thing, is that we know in the playoffs, some of those shots that normally go in probably aren't going to go in. And we know, like, even with the 3-point shots, right? Like, it's not going to be the same level of efficiency. But the defense, if they can do that, because that's really the key, like, in the playoffs, is as long as you can defend at a high level, you just have to be a solid offensive team. Like, what you can't do is you can't be bad. I mean, you definitely can't be bad defensively, obviously, but like, if your the defense is probably the thing that can carry over the most, because guys are going to be more fatigued. Teams are going to try to take away what teams do best offensively. So, when you do have a guy like Shea, even if he's like a little worse than he is in the regular season,
Mm-hmm.
as long as he's not bad, right? Like, and the defense is good, that's kind of the best way to make like an extended run in the postseason. Like, if your best player can score at a good rate and you have like a very high level defense around them, that's your best shot,
Yeah,
right?
for
Versus
sure.
like if you're just like an elite offensive team, but there's nothing you can do defensively, or vice versa, right? And
Yeah.
that's really what OKC is doing. So we'll see, what happens in game 2, because again, I think Ingram can play better. But is he going to play better? We don't know. But I think the issue is really when you don't have Zion, it just makes things harder for everyone else, right? Like, honestly, you can probably say he might be their best, like, quote unquote guard. Like, he's not actually a guard, but you know what I mean? Like, in
Yeah.
terms of like, he can handle the
Facilitating,
ball.
bringing it
Yeah,
up.
he can
Yeah.
facilitate, with the drive and kick. He's just a lot more dangerous, I think, than the other guys. Like,
He's
and
the
it's
best
there.
initiator of the 3. I agree.
Yeah, and also it's like he's the best player. Like, when he's out there, it makes the game easier for everyone else, because a lot of the things he does, they don't do, right? Like, Ingram can drive to the basket and kind of finish over people, but it's not with like a lot of physicality. It's not with strength. It's like, through other ways. It's more like skill, more finesse. Same with McCollum, right?
Yeah.
Like, he's not driving down the lane and dunking over people.
Right.
It's a lot of floaters. It's a lot of these like tough trick, flip angle shots, right? Like, it's just kind of difficult.
Yeah.
And like, it's nice to have tough shot makers in the playoffs. Um, from the perimeter, but you also do need a guy that can kind of attack the basket as well. And I think, with some of these other jump shooting teams, that's where it's going to be a problem. If you can't really find ways to get to the rim and score, or at least get close to the rim, it's gonna be rough
Yeah.
because jump shots are not gonna fall at the same rate. So, with OKC, it's nice to see that they can win a game where they don't really shoot that well. But then you still have to factor in, okay, what would this look like if Zion played? Because like you could make the credible case that like New Orleans could pull off the upset because they do have more playoff experience. It's just a matter of like, like, is it going to happen? But we know Zion's probably not coming back. I know he's supposed to be reevaluated in what, like, at this point, like a week and a half, but that's just a reevaluation date. I doubt we see him again.
Yeah.
So, at this point, New Orleans, ideally, you need to win game two, or else the series is over. Kind of like what we said, and again, 2-0 isn't a death sentence. You know what I mean? But it just becomes increasingly harder because of the fact that you can't really afford to lose any more games consecutively. Like, you could get away with losing two in a row, but if you lose two in a row, that means you basically can't lose any more games unless you're at like, unless it's like, 2-2 or whatever.
Right.
Because like if you lose one more game and you're down 2-0, it's 3-0. No one's
Right.
ever done that before. And then if you win one game, but then you lose the next one, congratulations, you're down 3-1. And
Yeah,
that
it's
doesn't really
GG.
happen. Yeah, that doesn't really happen either. Right? You know what I mean? Like, so you pretty much have to win 4 out of 5 if you lose the first two. And it's just tough, right? Because again, fatigue's going to be a factor. And when you're without your best player, you're going to run out of gas. So we'll see what New Orleans can do. But I think we both expected OKC to win this series without Zion. But I think it was a little bit more competitive than what most people expected. Like I gave New Orleans a chance. Like I think like they could win a game, maybe two, if Ingram plays really well. But if he doesn't, and he just gets shut out because of Lou Dort, no way.
Yeah, that's how I feel too.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it in terms of the games, right? Obviously, we're gonna have other games over the course, right? We're gonna have some game twos coming up. Assuming you watch this episode before those games, right? We're gonna have Magic Cavs game two, Knicks Sixers game two, and Lakers Nuggets game two, right? We talked about it in the live stream. We expect probably that all three home teams are probably gonna keep it up and probably win game two because I think the home teams are just better. Obviously, we could be wrong. And there could be an upset. I feel like the one that's most likely to possibly be an upset is probably the Knicks Sixers one, depending on the health of Embiid. Right, if he gets back to what he does, what he did in the first quarter of Game One, then that's where an upset could happen. But if he looks more like the second half, I don't see it. Well, we'll see though.
Yeah, that I agree. It's tough. But at the end of the day, this is the playoffs. The home court advantage is a real thing. With New York, the Garden, it's real. I think they'll feed off the energy. And that's kind of how I feel about it. But as for the others, I think those two other games are going to go to the home team.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how last year there were a lot of upsets at home, in the playoffs, right?
Yeah.
Like there were a lot of like game one, the home team would lose at home and then win game two at home, but now it's completely flipped. Where like every home team won game one, which is just again kind of goes back to the volatility and the randomness of the playoffs, where it's like
Anything can happen.
Like anything can happen, right? And it goes to show the difference between the regular season and postseason, which we're continuing, to have to relearn the lesson. Sometimes because again, you can be tricked in the regular season in the playoffs.
For sure.
Happened to all of us, right?
Yep.
Happened to us last year. It's gonna happen again, and it's gonna happen again and again and again.
Yeah. At least in one of the games or scenarios in series, somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And then in terms of news rumors, Chris Paul linked to the Spurs. San Antonio has emerged as a potential suitor, according to Mark Stein, if CP3 hits free agency this summer. I don't really think it. I mean, I understand from like a veteran mentorship perspective, that, like you mentioned in the live stream, he can throw some good entry passes to Wemby. He can teach him, to punch a guy or whatever. But at the same time, like I just don't necessarily feel like if you're the Spurs, I mean, it makes sense to add some veterans, but I think from Golden State's perspective, mainly, it's like the only reason they would basically let him go is if they couldn't find a trade for him and they just didn't want to bring him back at all.
Yeah.
But it's like if Golden State wanted to kind of bring him back, they could waive him and then sign him to like I guess a cheaper deal. But I don't know, like the Spurs thing, I guess, but like I would think, but also I would think for him, he would probably prefer to like one last chance to like ring chase. Like obviously it didn't work out in Golden State this year, which I didn't expect it to. But I think it went even worse because this is the first time in forever that he didn't even make the playoffs,
Yeah.
right? Like
It
we
was
saw
first
him
time
on
in
the
10 years or something, right?
exactly, like yeah, and that's the tough part about the West is that it's very good, it's very deep, a lot of really good teams. The Spurs could potentially be one of those good teams, assuming that they add more talent next to Wemby. But I don't know, like it makes sense from the perspective of like a really good point guard that can actually pass the ball and run the offense. But I would think if you're the Spurs, I think it would just make sense to like, maybe add some veteran guys like that are a little bit different, and then like try to see if you can get like the talent level at the point guard spot. Because I think like Chris Paul can still play, but I just think he's better suited as a backup. Like I think if you're the Spurs, get a real legitimate starting caliber point guard, and then see what you can do.
Yeah, like that's how I feel. And the hard thing is like I don't want the Spurs to address their guard issue in this year's draft. I think, the Chris Paul move can work. It's just a matter of fact, like, you have to have a very good starting point guard, I think. And I don't see that in the draft. I don't know what kind of free agents are going to be around. I don't know who's going to get traded or moved where. But in some way, shape, or form, I think the Chris Paul thing can work out. I know the Homelander, when we were talking about it, was like, ew. And I get it, but at the same time, he doesn't have a lot of time left to win a ring. And I'm more on the line of like, he probably wouldn't even want to go to San Antonio in the first place. I think he would be more inclined to actually try and compete.
I don't know where that would be. Maybe it's in Golden State again, but like
Yikes. Good luck.
I
I
don't
don't
know.
even know if that's a competitive, team
Yeah,
anymore.
right. Like that's the issue. I don't know. So who knows
Yeah.
where he goes, but chances are, if he like is gonna leave, he would have to take significantly less money, and his
Yeah.
contract is non-guaranteed. I just don't know what Golden State's gonna do. So like they could just like trade him, and then somebody else could win, right? So who knows?
Yeah.
Um, Also, according to Mark Stein, um, Dejounte Murray seems to be the preferred trade target by teams eyeing the Hawks backcourt. I think it has to do with the contract. I mean, his contract obviously is going to go up after the extension kicks in, but it's still not like 40 million. It's like closer to 30, right? Like it's like what 25, 26, 27, 28, 30, whatever it is. Um it's not 40 plus million, right?
Right.
So I just think like in general, you don't have to give up as much. And like even though Trey Young is the better player, right? Like, depending on what your team is, you're gonna have to give up a lot in order to get him. And I just don't necessarily know like if it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
You know, for certain teams. Because we know that there's gonna be some teams that are gonna, you know, like try to see if they can snuff out and trade for Trey Young.
Yeah.
Right? The Lakers are gonna try. We know the Spurs are gonna try to do it, because those teams have been rumored a lot, and there might be some other secret team that we don't know about. Maybe it's Detroit. Who knows? They could do anything. But like at the same time, I feel like Murray's probably the quote unquote easier one to get because he just doesn't make as much money. And I feel like there's probably some teams that might prefer Dejounte Murray over Trey Young. I think there's going to be other teams that would say otherwise, but it really does depend. I don't know what the heck the Hawks are going to do. Very little of what they've done over the last few seasons has made sense. It all
Yeah.
just goes back to the kind of fluky, fraudulent, phony Eastern Conference Finals run.
Yeah.
And then from that point on, they just decided, like, hey, we were only 2 games away from making the finals. So let's go all in and make a championship caliber move by adding DeJounte Murray.
Yeah.
How did it work out?
Yeah.
Not exactly all that great, did it?
Yeah. It's almost 4 a.m. and we're talking about the freaking Atlanta Hawks and their missteps. Like they're in a win now mode. They try to go into a win now mode after 1 year of relevancy in the playoffs. It's beyond me, but I think that does make sense. If you're trying to actually get a move to happen, how many teams would be really trying to get Trey Young? That would be the question. There might not be a market for the guy. And I know he recently was talking about, I want to be here, but I want to win. Basically saying, I'd love Atlanta, but at the same time, might not be the option for me, which is valid for sure. But, if you look at DeJounte Murray, I think he's the better value. Definitely better bang for your buck. And I'm sure he has a lot of suitors. It's just matter of what are the Atlanta Hawks going to actually ask for this guy?
Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me if they completely overvalue him and then mess themselves up for another 5 years. You know?
Yeah, we'll see.
well.
Then according to NBCS Chicago, Bulls offered DeMar up to 80 million. So basically a 2-year, $80 million extension, which is nuts.
Yeah,
But
that's insane.
but he turned it down.
Mhm.
So that kind of suggests that he might be okay with going elsewhere. Maybe he can still re-sign with Chicago. I don't really know what happens because, like, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense for him to stay in Chicago. Like, I know he had a good season. I just don't think it really makes a whole lot of sense. Like, I think if you're the Bulls, you might as well just like kind of commit to like a rebuild with your young guys. Like, move on from DeRozan, move on from Vucevic, move on from Caruso, move on from Drummond, and just kind of be like, even move on from Levine possibly, and just be like, we got Kobe White, we got some of these other guards. And then let's kind of just bottom out and let's see what we can do in terms of rebuilding in the draft. But like that doesn't seem like what they like to do. Like it just seems like they're okay with just being average, right? Like slightly relevant, but like just but also irrelevant at the same time, right? Like in the play-in, right? Like we thought they were going to make the playoffs because they destroyed the Atlanta Hawks, who also are kind of stinky. And then they got blown out by the Miami Heat, who didn't even have Jimmy Butler and Terry Rozier.
Yeah.
And so if you're the Bulls, you feel like you should probably continue building around that. Like I would say no. Like Kobe White's great. Build around that, right? But the veteran guys, move on from them and like bring in like, some other veteran guys, but not like 40 million a year DeRozan.
Yeah.
Like just don't do that.
Yeah,
There's no
start the
point.
rebuild. Start the rebuild now. And with the DeRozan thing, it makes sense because the guy, we know that he has been on some playoff teams, and he's given us some very intriguing series throughout his career. It's just a matter of the fact that he's getting old. I think this will be his 16th season or something like that. So it'll be like 35, 36 next season. So that's pushing it, and he's still a good player. It's just I don't think he probably wants to waste any more years in Chicago, which is probably why he declined the extension. And I think he'll go somewhere else, which is good.
Yeah, if he turned down like 2 years, 80 million, I would have a very hard time believing that he would stay in Chicago
And he's
because
probably looking for like a 3-year deal on a contender or at least a good team.
right, yeah, because again, it's like it's just I'm honestly surprised that the Bulls even offered that
Yeah,
to
that's
him. Like,
wild.
because again, like I just don't think that makes a lot of sense. Because like maybe you would give him like some type of extension that makes it easier to trade him, like I don't know, in the off season or something. But like 40 million a year, that seems like a lot. Like
Yeah.
if that's what it is, like I mean, maybe because I know like the Miles Turner extension, there was like some math where they just kind of used some cap to like fill in some of the salary. But the Bulls are an over the cap team. They're not a team that has cap space, so. Like that would kind of make me think that it was literally like a $40 million a year extension, which again is just kind of wild. But again, the Bulls kind of do what the Bulls do. For
Yeah.
whatever reason, doesn't really make a lot of sense, but you just go with it.
Yeah, and it means I guess like bringing him back on like that kind of salary would be insane. Because then you'd have to deal with the Zach LaVine thing, and I think that would probably spell trade. But regardless, what a mess. Start the rebuild. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I don't even know where he would go because there's not a lot of teams with cap space, anyways, other
Yeah.
than like teams that aren't really contenders. So I don't even like so unless he takes some type of discount. Like I don't see him like I don't know where he would go that's an actual contender. So
Right.
like I don't know. Maybe he's okay with that, but I don't know. Like I would think like he would still want like a decent, like you said, 2-3 year deal that
Yeah.
pays him like a decent amount, not like some mid level exception amount where it's like 10 million a year.
Yeah, because if it was about the money, the guy would have taken that extension for sure.
Yeah. Next up, Clay Thompson. Could he be headed to Dallas? I don't think so. I mean, I could be wrong. Obviously, there's been lots of talks about him after, the goose egg in the playing game. But I just think it's more likely that he stays with Golden State. There's just not really much of a reason to leave, unless it's like a scenario where it's like he just doesn't want to be there anymore. But
Yeah.
like it doesn't seem like he doesn't want to be there anymore. Players don't seem like that they don't want him to be there anymore. So like I know when they asked Steph about like some of those guys coming back, he was like, "I want to win." But like at the same time, like Draymond, he mentioned that he wanted him to come back, as did Kurt. So I just, I know there's been talks about like maybe he goes to Orlando, or maybe he goes to a team like Dallas, or maybe he goes, somewhere else and just kind of just I don't even know, like turns into Ray Allen on another team. I
Yeah.
just don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. But at the same time, I guess like for him, like it's kind of rough because like if you stay in Golden State, you're probably not winning anymore. But if you leave, are you really going to be that much happier? Like, like if you go to Orlando, is he the missing piece that turns Orlando into a championship team? I don't think so. And it's like, the other contenders, he's not getting 25 million a year because they don't have the cap space. So it's like I think it just makes more sense to just stay in Golden State, ride it out into the sunset, have those guys retire together, get the
Yeah.
statues done, and kind of just not win anymore.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the way that it seems like it's gearing up to be. I think he's
Yeah.
going to be a Warrior for life. If I was the general manager, I wouldn't, have him back. But I think what else can you really do at this point? You're stuck with the core until they're done. Got to ride it till the wheels fall off. I think that's what they're going to do. And then hopefully they actually strike gold. During their rebuild, but it could be end of an era. But who knows? They might have like a weird season next year, similar to this one. But they actually make it out of the play-in, then they make a playoff run, then everybody's talking about them again. It's all about
Yeah.
recency bias, honestly. But we'll see.
Yeah, I just think, given the normal trajectory of like, dynasties and like long-term runs, I think it's probably just more likely that like you said, it's probably more likely that they may have like another playoff run where like they get into the playoffs, but maybe they still go out like in the first round, like as opposed to like I don't think they're winning another title. Like, and I said that before the season started, where I think it was Draymond who mentioned like we can win 2 to 3 more, and I was like, I think it's probably more likely that you win no more. Like, and that's just kind of what happens. Like,
Facts.
obviously, like maybe if you make some huge move that comes out of nowhere, like maybe if they trade for Giannis, but like,
But
are
is
they
that gonna
trading for?
happen?
Yeah, like, and do they have the assets at this point? Because like I think
Yeah.
some of the young guys have been devalued a little bit. Not that they're bad, but even like a guy like Kaminga, you're gonna have to pay him at some point. And
Yeah.
I think like he's actually gonna be due for an extension in the off season. So either they're gonna give him the extension this off season, or they're not gonna pay him, and then they're gonna let him enter restricted free agency. And so like if another team gonna be up for that? I mean, he seems like a good player, but you know, are you gonna pay him like $100 million? Like I don't
No,
know about.
not yet.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't know about that. I mean, I
Yeah.
could be wrong, but like, because he is good. It's not like he's a bad player. He
Yeah.
can get buckets. We know the nickname, but like at the same time, like, can he be like one of the two, three best players on a championship team? Like, probably not. It feels more so like he could be the best player on like, you know, a 30 something win team,
Yeah.
but probably not like, a championship team. And that's not him. Like that's a lot of players, right? Like we saw what it looked like this season with Kyle Kuzma as the best player on a Wizards team. And it wasn't necessarily that great. So,
Oh my God! What a circus, bro.
right. So that's just kind of how it goes. You know what I mean? Like that's not me picking on Kaminga. Like it's just when you're in like a different tier, like there's it's just not how it normally would be. Um Tobias Harris possibly headed back to Detroit. So according to Pompey of the Philadelphia Inquirer, they think it's unlikely that he returns to Philly. So obviously we know he's caught the ire of Philly fans every time he misses a shot, even if it's not an air ball. It just seems like they are like intent on just booing him off the floor.
Yeah, they don't
Yeah,
want him there, bro.
yeah, you feel for the guy. It's rough. Um, I just think the problem is he's not a bad player. I just feel like he's in a spot where like you're almost kind of like a little too dependent on him to do stuff. And like luckily like they've gotten performances out of other guys, so like it doesn't hurt as bad. But like if he's on the team making like 40 million a year, you need him to be productive. You can't have like 7 points and 9 rebounds in the playoff game, especially in a game where Embiid is just not really 100%. And I think for Philly, we've kind of heard of their plan basically of like getting some cap space and possibly making a run at signing somebody. Like but they poach Paul George away from Philly, right? Like maybe they're the team that gets Klay Thompson and throws him a ton of money, right?
Hmm.
Or maybe it's somebody else. Like we just don't know. But in order to create the cap space, you're probably going to have to let a lot of guys walk. And Tobias Harris, because he has like a huge cap hold, right? Like he's going to be the guy. And it's like, are you going to miss him if you're Philadelphia? Probably not. Like, but then it's like,
Yeah.
Roy, you sure you really want this? Like, I guess, like in
Yeah.
some ways, there are things that he can do that they don't really have because they don't really have like a four that can really, score from the perimeter.
You're right.
Um, and it's like, the expectations in Detroit aren't going to be the same. Like, I don't think Detroit's going to like start, booing and start complaining the way Philly does if he plays
Right.
poorly. And he's not going to make 30 million a year. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
Detroit is half cap space, and also like they're not going to give him a 4 or 5 year deal. This is not going to be like a Tobias Harris over me situation. Like the Jimmy Butler meme or whatever it is. Like it's not going to be as long term
Yeah.
of a deal. So it's not going to be as disastrous as that decision was in Philly. But either way, like, again, if you're Detroit, yeah, bring some veterans in. Like, not really bad at all. Like, it kind of is what it is. Not really something I would have expected. But I don't expect Detroit to really get, like, who the heck is coming to Detroit that's like a superstar? That's not happening. Like, so,
Yeah.
you're going to have to probably settle for guys like Tobias Harris. But again, look at Houston, right? They brought in Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks. They're not superstars, but they're solid players and they made Houston better, right? They almost made the playoffs. They
Yeah.
ended up missing, but like,
They
that's
got
still a
close,
lot.
bro. They got close
Yeah, they
enough.
got close, and that's a lot better than what it was before, when they looked like one of the most embarrassing basketball products you'll ever see in any level of basketball. Like there might have been some middle school basketball teams that might have looked better than what the Rockets looked like,
Facts. They look
a
like
couple of years.
AAU.
Yeah, and that's no yeah, AAU is the perfect term, and that's no disrespect, or maybe it does sound like disrespect, but it wasn't great.
Yeah, they messed up big time, but now they're on the right trajectory. They made the right moves, and I think the Detroit one. I mean, like it's okay. It's puzzling, I guess, but at the same time, you look at Harris, you look at his production. I think it's solid. It's just around Embiid, not the best fit. I think he kind of gets relegated to like a corner specialist at times. He's not MPJ. He's not as efficient. But then when he's not in the corner, he's doing God knows whatever, he's doing whatever he wants, and that's not ideal, I think, especially when you have Embiid. Like, it would be nice to have another creator, but when you have guys that need the ball at such high volumes, like Embiid and Maxey, I think that's kind of a recipe for disaster. So I just think, maybe he goes somewhere more suited for him, and maybe Detroit is the perfect spot for him, and they'll have a draft pick, so they'll be better than last year, I think, or this year.
Yeah, yeah, he's kind of in that tier of players where it's like, he's a good offensive player, but
Yeah,
not quite good enough that you want to necessarily like run your offense around him. But he also is a guy that kind of needs the ball, sort of like
exactly.
for his offense to really be effective. Because, like you said, there's a lot of possessions where he's kind of like just spotting up in the corner, and he's become a much improved, outside shooter, which is nice. But he's kind of at his best like when he's able to have the ball and kind of like post up and like maybe get downhill, hit some floaters, shoot over the top, like kind of like I don't know, a poor man's version of like like a Mellow, or somebody like that. But the problem is like he's not really like a superstar offensive player, right? He's more like a role player.
Yeah.
So it's like, how much do you really want him to like have the ball in his hands and really create, especially on a team where it's like, hey, Joel Embiid, can I have the ball? I'm Joel Embiid. Can I have the ball?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the rough part there. So, like you said, he's probably better suited for a different type of team that's not
Yeah.
Philadelphia. That probably would be better suited to have like some type of like 3-and-D guy,
Right.
next to Embiid that can like rebound or whatever. Not necessarily like a scoring forward. Like I just that needs the ball. Like I just don't think that makes a whole lot of sense. I think you would prefer to have the ball in Embiid and Maxi's hands more, and kind of just try to fit guys around them that are more like 3-and-D or like athletes or whatever. Not a guy like Harris who's more like I kind of need the ball to score, but I'm not like one of the best scorers in the NBA type guy.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and then finally, last but not least, Nick Claxton, right? Of the Brooklyn Nets, right? The very good Brooklyn Nets team this year. Um, so according to Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype, he's reported that even though there's a quote unquote greater than 50% chance that he comes back to Brooklyn, there's also a chance that a team like New Orleans could grab him in a sign and trade deal.
Hmm.
So that would be kind of interesting because if I'm Brooklyn, if I'm going to be honest, I don't really want to pay $100+ million a year for Nick Claxton. I'm not saying that he's bad because he's not a bad player at all, right? He's good, especially on the defensive end. Good athlete, lob threat, great shot blocker, very mobile defensively, even out on the perimeter, right, where he can kind of move his feet. So in a switching defense, that's awesome. And in a way, it kind of is, but and that's a nice player to have. But do I want to pay $100+ million for that? Like, no, not really. Like, if I'm gonna be honest, I mean, what did that get us here, right? Like, the Nets are, you know, probably one of the most like kind of just I don't even know, like just kind of like nothing teams in the NBA.
Yeah.
Like, there's very little in Brooklyn that like makes you really feel good, and like some of it's like of their own doing, and some of it's just bad luck, right? Like it was bad luck that they had Durant, Kyrie, and Harden, and lost all of them basically in the span of like a year. Like
Yeah.
you had all three of them together, it looked like they were gonna do something, and then they didn't. They got hurt. They decided to jeopardize the team by doing, random stuff, and then they just kind of fell apart. And now you're stuck with Mikal Bridges, who you could have traded and got stuff back for, but it seems like he's not quite as good as what you were expecting. So now he's probably not going to have as much trade value. So even if you wanted to trade him, you're not going to get as much back. You paid Cam Johnson $100+ million, and he's not really $100 million player. And now you're going to do the same thing for Nick Claxton, who is also just not $100+ million a year player. He's just not. So if you're New Orleans and you can get him in a sign and trade and it's not $100 million, that honestly would be cool. Especially because it's like, what do they do with Valanciunas? Does he stay? Because I think he's a free agent. Does he stay? Does he leave? I don't know. Claxton, as an athletic lob threat guy, would be an interesting fit. The only concern I would have is like Zion can't shoot, Claxton can't shoot. And Ingram, is a decent shooter, but he's not like a 3-point guy. He's more like a mid-range and then attack from, inside the arc type of guy. That's a lot of guys that like aren't necessarily the most comfortable taking threes. Like it just kind of feels like a potential for it to be really nasty. Maybe if you swap, somebody out, like okay, but I don't know. Like it's interesting. It's like we talked about like with Jared Allen. That'd be cool for New Orleans, but it doesn't seem like he'd be on the move anytime soon. Maybe he is, but I don't know. Kind of a weird thing, but I feel like he probably would be better suited somewhere else, just not making $100 million+. Because if he's making that much money for Brooklyn, that's a lot of money for like guys that are not going to make your team that good.
Yeah, and he's pretty good, defensively. And like you said, a lob threat. You do it all, except shoot, pretty much. So that always helps. But regardless, I mean, with New Orleans, I don't think it's a good fit. I think you should probably look elsewhere for a big. I think you need somebody who could space the floor. You've already got some issues with shooting, anyways. So I think your best bet is probably to avoid a non-shooter. But in theory, I guess it could work. But you'd be heavily reliant on like the fact that Zion needs to improve his 3-point shooting, which is
Like if
probably not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Because like if he does improve his 3-point shooting, then that honestly would make a lot of sense. Because it's
Yeah.
like you don't really need like a interior post scoring guy like Valanciunas, even though he's been good for them. But
Yeah.
like if Zion actually could shoot the ball, right, then that would make then you can honestly put any kind of big around, and then
Anything.
like that type of big makes a lot of sense. But like he can't shoot, probably
Yeah.
never going to be able to shoot outside of like 12, 15 feet or whatever. So at that point, I do kind of wonder what they do, because again, New Orleans will have some questions in the offseason, just like Brooklyn, regardless of what happens in the playoffs. So,
Yeah.
well, that pretty much does it for today's episode of All Fall Takes. On the East Coast, it is basically 4 in the morning. So if you couldn't tell by the end of the show, we were kind of fried, but because we love everybody, we wanted to make sure that we got this episode done.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you for all the support, everyone.
yeah, in as efficient and as quality of a manner as possible. So hopefully we did right. Again, as you mentioned, shout out to people like the Homelanders, Xander Cade, Keith Wells, who showed out in the live chat in our live streams. Um, in terms of the next ones, we're probably not going to have any until like the elimination games,
Yeah.
right? So like, if people remember what we did last year, and the people, these are some of the people who were in the live streams last year. Remember, we did ones at the beginnings of the series and at the end. So keep in mind that. Again, continue to look for our socials, right, as we post content there. Like the shorts and whatnot. We appreciate all the support. And I guess we'll see you next week.